Well, good morning, all. Good morning.
Do we have the agenda tonight?
Glad you all made it. No blizzard, but it is snowing, and we have cold weather. So it's a pleasure to be here and an honor to receive this appointment. And I really look forward to working with this group. It's like a number of groups, which is kind of interesting. So there's this whole national group who I run into at various conferences around the country during my career. And here we are. I've got that group here with all of these election officials that I work with for years and years and years. And I've got the Bureau of Elections here, and Secretary Benson's new staff that's on board, which are fantastic people, have brought a lot of depth to the department and to the election process. And you will meet them as we go around and do introductions in a moment. So I really see this as a fabulous opportunity to bring the local, county and local election expertise to the room, along with those of you that are involved nationally with various models and whatnot, and experiences that you've had and have seen in other states that can assist the Department of State rolling out some really earth-shattering for this state in terms of reforms that have occurred primarily through the ballot. So this is just a great opportunity to get a lot of input from communities that were involved in the proposal last year, that are also involved in elections as nonprofits and as election officials. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Benson to make a few comments, and then we will do introductions.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris. I'm honored that you agreed to co-chair or chair this esteemed gathering of people, and like you, I'm just thrilled to see all of you around this table as well. You are people who I've worked with on the local level for years, and people who I have worked with on the national level for years. And each of you were intentionally selected to be a part of this task force, this committee that is charged with taking our elections from where we are now to being what I believe we can be, which is the best state in the country for fair, accessible, and secure elections. And the way that we get from here to there is with all of you. And so I'm grateful that all of you have agreed to give up time out of each of your valuable days and schedules, the work that you do, to help us get from here to there. Because thanks to the work of Proposal 3, we've seen, many of you around the table, by the way, were part of that work, and we thank you for it, because we've seen now the voice of the voters, which is to say they too want Michigan's elections to be among the best in the country. And I believe, and I know those of you who, like me, work on their behalf, believe that that's what they deserve and no less. So we've got the pieces in place to get there, and we are building at the Department of State a strategic plan, essentially on how we revamp many aspects of the office to make it a model for the rest of the country in various different ways. But there is no area that is more important at this critical moment in our democracy nationwide and here in Michigan to get this right. And to do so with the wind at our back, with the support of the voters, as expressed through not just Proposal 3, but Proposal 2. And so we are all charged now with ensuring that their will, their vision that went into these proposals and other opportunities as well become a reality. And so I'm here really to work alongside all of you to get there. And in particular, I'm seeking your advice and counsel as a part of this group. Those of you who do this work on the local level, please do not be shy about sharing with us your on-the-ground perspectives of how things will actually play out. Because there is no one else in this room that can share that but you. And we will listen, and we will respond, and we will work alongside of you to support you as we work to implement the changes we must implement by law, but also advocate for other changes to make your work easier. For those of you in the national world, you've done this on the national level in various other states. You've seen how this works. The former secretaries, as well as former clerks who have overseen the implementation of these changes in states like West Virginia, Kentucky, and Colorado. So we're grateful for your input as well, because we're going to need you to help teach us what we can do better. Those of us who've been on the ground here in Michigan may not necessarily know what's worked and what hasn't in other states. And so please do not be shy on advising us on that as well. And what you'll see as we get to know each other and as we work together over the course of this time of this task force is that each of you have a unique skill set and expertise that again was selected to be a part of this for a reason. And we all work on behalf of the state of Michigan and our citizens, but with a very clear goal in mind, which is to make our state one that can be a model democracy for the rest of the country. The last thing I'll just say is that I really see the scope of this task force as being twofold in terms of substance. One, we do have a number of reforms on our plate with the passage of Proposal 3. So first and foremost, we want to work alongside of you to identify ways to implement those reforms. We've got a phenomenal team at the Bureau of Elections who is tasked with, they're taskmasters, they're implementers, and with your ideas, with your vision, with your expertise, we can really amplify and excel what we're doing there to ensure that we're learning from others in other states, but also being responsive to all of you on the local level who may want to, in some cases, warn us, in other cases, advise us on how things might actually play out in real time in your communities. So certainly evaluating and doing a deep dive on how to effectively and with an eye towards excellence implement the reforms of Proposal 3. That's at the top of this group's agenda, but I don't want us to just stop there. Because of Proposal 3, we have an opportunity to essentially get up to speed with all of the other top states in elections in this country. And that's great, because that means we don't have to spend our time advocating for things like no reason absentee voting and early voting and things that are in place in many other states. We're already there. Now we just have to implement it and do it well. But then the second step is, what can we do more? How can we become the next innovative state? How can we take the fact that we're now caught up and move even further? What are the resources that we need to do that? Those of you who do this work on the national level, tell us what you're seeing coming around the corner in the field of elections. And those of you on the local level, tell us whether or not you think that's a fit. Those types of innovations are a fit for your communities. And then finally, we are blessed with the expertise of so many local election officials here today that I hope you'll really advise us on what you feel and the nitty-gritty needs to change in the law, in the policies, in funding and resources, because you've got at your disposal as well national experts who can, whether it's identifying more resources, staff, or other types of support, can be of assistance in supporting the work that you're doing. So I'm hoping that as a third piece of this, there will be some relationships and collaboration opportunities that go outside the scope of this room, but perhaps can help our local election officials as they connect and build relationships with those of you who've come in or on the phone from around the country to advise and help us. So, and we do it all under the guidance and leadership of one of the best director of elections in the country, who I'm very grateful has continued to work with us and advise us and be involved, because we know this is a labor of love for you also. So thank you, Chris, again for being here, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you. It is a labor of love. But I am retired. But yeah, I mean, all these things that were in Prop 3 that would love to have gotten done a long time ago. So we are where we are. A couple housekeeping things before we start around the room. So these mics here are for recording purposes, so you don't need them for talking. But you do need to speak up when you talk. We've got a number of people on the phone that will also be introduced as we go around. Restroom down the hall. It is a unit, or both sexes, so that's, you know, and there are also restrooms on the ground floor, and I believe there's coffee on the ground floor as well. So with that, again, speak up. We'll go around the room. I'm Chris Thomas. I'm retired elections director, and pleased to be here. I'm working with Bipartisan Policy Center and also with Center for Secure and Modern Elections on a couple projects dealing with various election reforms. And as a side, I am working with the DC government on a campaign finance issue. So retirement, sort of. So it's my pleasure to be here, and it's an honor, and thank you for asking. So we'll start to the left, and go ahead, Sally.
Okay, I'm Sally Williams. I'm the current Director of Elections. I'm thrilled to death to be here, working with Chris again and our new team, and really so excited to get the involvement of a group like this as we go to implement the details of something that's all wonderful ideas, but as we all know, may get a little complex as we get into the details. So this whole mix of people will just be wonderful help to all of us. So thank you for coming.
I'm Lori Bourbonnais, also with the Bureau of Elections. I'm the manager of the election liaison section. So you probably have all, the clerks talk to myself or my staff. We try to answer questions from the clerk community and voters. I would like to say thank you to Secretary Benson for allowing us to be at the table, and echo Sally. This is really very exciting for us. It's great to all be in a room together, sort of issue spot, find where the problems may be, find where we can move forward, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation today.
I'm David Becker. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Election Innovation and Research, formerly Director of Pew's elections team, and before that, Senior Attorney with the Justice Department's voting section. I'm really honored to be a part of this and to be here at the table with all of you and focusing so much on the hard work of implementation, which it's so often that we seem like people feel as if you cross the finish line when you pass a good policy, but really it just gets you to the starting line. And having such a great group of experienced election officials in particular here is so important.
Matt Singer, consultant with a firm called Impactual, here also with the Center for Secure and Modern Elections. I got my start around election work doing civic engagement work, helped start National Voter Registration Day, and also realized that registering a bunch of people is way easier when the laws are better, and also the laws don't mean much if they're not administered well. So I've been diving into the implementation world, excited to be here and to learn from all of you.
Whitney Quisenberry from the Center for Civic Design. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of it, both Secretary Benson and Chris. We are one of the nationals. We're very small, but we think mighty. Our focus is on civic design and kind of making sure that every step of the voter journey and the election administration that lives behind that voter journey is as smooth and effective and gets as many people to participate as we can.
Excellent. And good morning. My name is Hester Wheeler. I'm your Assistant Secretary of State, longtime Executive Director with NAACP right here in Detroit, former Assistant County Executive. For me, this is a magic moment. I care very deeply about voting rights and elections and getting it right. So thank you all.
Good morning. My name is Marta Gonzalez Cortez. I'm the Vice President of Community Investment with the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. I am from West Michigan. I live in Grand Rapids, work in Kalamazoo, have spent my entire life working on the civil rights of farm workers and the working poor, primarily immigrants in rural and urban spaces. And so I think what I bring to the table is that concern about the working poor, people that struggle on that second and third shift to try to figure out how to get to the election site on the day of an election, and people that struggle with basic literacy. But the farm worker components as well are near and dear to my heart.
I'm Lloyda Tapia. I'm the new Director of Public Engagement for the Office of the Secretary. I just moved here 3 weeks ago from DC, and I look forward to working and collaborating with you all as we put together our strategy to engage and educate the public and make sure we're using our resources on the ground that have already been building on this for many, many years.
Hi, good morning. I'm Trip Adams. I'm here as the chapter lead of the Truman National Security Project, also a military reservist and former veteran. So of the three parts that the Secretary mentioned, I'll really be looking at the security part, secure elections, and then from the accessibility as a military veteran who still deploys, that's really important to me.
Great. Elizabeth Hundley, Livingston County Clerk, and I'm also an attorney, but I have been working on modernizing the clerk's office since I came into office. So I'm truly honored to be here and participating in this. It's much needed.
I'm Steve Deitch, Elections Coordinator for Ottawa County. Our office is extremely excited to be here working on these proposals, and implementing all of the things that are coming with Proposal 3, which was, as the Secretary mentioned, was universally approved across the state. Essentially, we had 58% of our voters in Ottawa approved the measure as well. So very interested to see what comes out of this group.
I'm Joe Roselle, the election director for Oakland County, the state's second largest county, and I'm very, very happy to be part of this committee. I'll tell you, as Chris mentioned, the clerk community has been pushing for these reforms as long as I've been in the position I've been in, and we're ecstatic to see that finally we're able to get those in place. And now we're on par with West Virginia and Kentucky as far as how we do our elections. So,
I'm Nancy Waters. I'm the Muskegon County Clerk, where I've been there for 12 years, and I've always been able to give the media the answer when they'd say, what do you think the voter turnout's going to be? And in November, I said 60%, and then I went home thinking, why did I say that? And we had 58.8. I'm here today because I have no idea of how many absentee ballots to order. We have a county-wide election for May 7th, and I'm a nervous wreck, so I would not have missed this opportunity with all of you who have so much to contribute. Thank you very much.
I'm Jackie Boudry. I'm the Ann Arbor City Clerk. I've been clerk in Ann Arbor for about 15 years, and we're particularly interested and excited in Ann Arbor for same-day voter registration, as well as the changes to in-person voter registration, and our focus is on ensuring access for our newest and youngest voters.
Good morning, I'm Benjamin Marantet. I serve as City Clerk for Traverse City, and I'm just pumped to be part of this really meaningful work.
Janice Winfrey, Detroit City Clerk. And as many of you know, we're excited about the passage of these laws. I'd like to think that we've been allowing our voters to vote 30 days, up to 30 days prior to every election in our various satellites. And I'd like to think that that let us know that we're ready for no reason absentee and registering same-day registration. So we're very excited. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of the committee.
Thank you for inviting me, Mrs. Winfrey. I'm George Jesus. I'm the City of Detroit Director of Elections. Thank you again.
I'm Rachel Huddleston. I'm with Michigan Protection and Advocacy Service. We're a nonprofit based in Lansing, and we work with voting rights around the state. So I'm very excited to be here and all these changes and how they can help our clients. So thank you.
My name is Matthew Weil. I direct the elections work at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. That's right, the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. We do exist. We are a nonprofit C3. We were founded by 4 former majority leaders of the Senate, 2 from each side. I'm the lucky one who gets to do a lot of policy with state and local officials at BPC, and I'm privileged to be here today. Thank you for inviting me to the state. And we also are launching our own task forces on the elections process. Jackie is going to be part of that, and Sally will be part of that as well. So I look forward to hearing Michigan, and they'll be bringing Michigan to the rest of the country as well.
Hi, my name is Sharon Delente. I'm the voting rights strategist at the ACLU. Most recently, I spent all of last year meeting with many of you. You invited me out to your clerks associations. Thank you for that. Working on Proposal 3, obviously, that has been a labor of love. In the works for, drafting for years and years, and as a vision, sort of delivering on what you all were trying to get, but couldn't get through our legislative mechanism, so we had to try another means, and we were very successful. Prior to that, I worked on voter protection for many, many years. I was Obama's 2012 voter protection director here in Michigan. Prior to that, I was a civil rights attorney, and I still do litigation at the ACLU as well. So I'm really happy to be with you all and for us to have such an exciting future ahead.
Good morning. My name is Kalila Spencer. I am a litigation partner at Honigman. Also serve as the Honigman's Inclusion, Equity, and Social Responsibility partner. That's my paying day job. I'm a volunteer with the NAACP. I'm a legal redress chair for the Michigan State NAACP, and also serve on the executive committee for the Detroit branch NAACP. And this is what we do every year. I also served as the vice chair on Proposal 3 and was a co-drafter of the legislation.
Good morning, I'm Mary Katowski. I'm the city clerk in the city of St. Clair Shores. I'm the retired Macomb County election director. Many years experience in municipal government, and I'm looking forward to this to keep residents and voters out of our office is our mandate, to be able to help them with technology today where they don't have to walk in.
I'm Chris Swope, the city clerk of the city of Lansing, and as one of the ones that gets to run an election this May, we're first, among the first, to implement Proposal 3. I'm really excited for this. And I think it's really important that we keep in mind that the voters wanted this, and it's important that the goal is to make it easier for folks to vote. But I also have a goal, we employ hundreds of election workers on election day, and we need to make it less confusing for them. There's a lot of areas for them to make mistakes, and as much as we can do to make it so that the voters have their voting rights protected, and the election workers have less opportunities for mistakes and confusion.
I'm Mary Clark. I'm the Delta Township Clerk, and many of you, if you go to state clerk meetings, you're in my building. Welcome all. I am also on the state board for Michigan Association of Municipal Clerks, and am at the education chair. So are currently slotting breakout sessions for our June conference dealing with Prop 3 and implementation. So timing's really good for us. I'm excited about it. I'm an opt-out. I have a May election, small school election. I'm an opt-out with Chris, so it's a learning experience on how Prop 3 changes all that. So it's all good.
I'm Julia Stone Street, pardon me, and I apologize now for all my coughing. I'm just getting over a cold. I'm clerk in Spring Arbor Township. That's about 10 miles west of Jackson. I've been clerk for about 9 years, and it will be interesting. I hear everybody's all excited. Jackson's pretty conservative. They're not as excited as everybody is talking. So hopefully I'll be able to take back some enthusiasm and some explanations and some clearing up. The one thing I'd like to make sure that happens, not just out of this group, but with the whole thing, is that we all understand what is going on and it comes out the same way. One of our biggest problems is so-and-so told me this, but so-and-so told you that, and it's not the same. We need to have little scripts or something, especially these first elections or two, until we're sure what we're doing, because we've already got this. I mean, we haven't even really started for our May election yet, and we've already got, no, we're doing it this way. No, we're doing it that way. I'm like, deep breath, and then we'll all do it the same way.
My name is Nick Shematero, and I guess I'm the team historian here. I started working in voter registration as director of the Macomb Voter Registration Committee in 1972, before Motor Voter, when we still had to get deputized by each individual city clerk in order to take registrations. I then moved on to be the city clerk in the city of Roseville. I was elected in 1977, incidentally, Chris was my analyst with the Secretary of State's office assigned to me. That was before either of us decided to dye our hairs gray. During that time, we ran what was called the CETA program, which most of you are not old enough to remember. It was a federal program called the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, where the federal government actually paid people to work. And we set up a CETA program that went door to door registering voters in the city of Roseville. That helped me the following year when I was elected to the state legislature, where I served for 20 years, and I was vice chair initially of the elections committee. And we introduced and moved legislation quickly that we learned from our CETA program that a lot of the people who were not registered to vote didn't let us register them to vote because they were afraid of being called for jury duty. So we moved legislation that moved the jury duty list from the voter registration list to the driver's license list, and by this time voter had gone into place. And that kind of helped somewhat, but not enough, but it helped somewhat move things along, as well as helping on some other areas. I introduced in the early 80s a system of automatic voter registration that was very similar to what's provided in Proposal 3, so that I'm living proof that patience is a virtue and persistence is important. So we couldn't get it through the legislature, as was pointed out. But that bill eventually morphed into Representative Dombrowski's bill, which we adopted in the latter part of my 20 years in the legislature, that created the qualified voter file. And I sat on the conference committee that wrote the qualified voter file legislation initially. Since leaving the legislature, I was assistant prosecuting attorney in Macomb County for 5 years and served for a little over 15 years as director of legislation and public policy for Michigan AFSCME, from which I retired, or I like to say I'm quasi-retired like Chris. You know, we keep busy anyway. Neither one of us could quit cold turkey. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this committee, thrilled to see automatic voter registration finally coming to Michigan under Prop 3, and anxious and excited to work with Jocelyn, who I've worked with for several years, went to the Wayne State Law School long before you were dean, but so we have that in common, and I'm real excited about working with you to implement these laws because I know that you're fully committed to them.
It makes one remember those days before term limits and the valuable legislators that we had at the time. So thank you, Nick. My name is Hillary Chambers, and I'm honored to serve as the Secretary's Chief of Staff.
Good morning, Mike Brady. I'm the Chief Legal Director for the Department of State. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Sally Marsh. I'm the Director of Special Projects for the Department of State.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Brader. I'm the Legal Policy Director for Secretary Benson, and one of my responsibilities is ensuring that Proposal 3 is properly implemented. We're doing everything we can to get our voting system to be the best in the country. So I really appreciate, again, everyone being here. We're really going to benefit from your insights and help us spot issues in advance. Of course, there will be some trial and error involved in some of this stuff, but as much as we can get from the outset going in the right direction is going to be really important. So thank you again.
And on the phone, we have Amber McReynolds.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amber McReynolds. I'm the current Executive Director at the National Vote at Home Institute. And up until August of 2018, I was the Director of Elections for the City and County of Denver. I was sort of the election official behind the scenes, architecting what is now known as the Colorado voting model that many states are interested in. I ran elections in Denver for over 13 years and oversaw the department when we were polling places with early voting and no excuse absentee, with DREs, and we converted to paper, and then we converted to vote centers, and now Colorado is at the model that we are today, and much of that was driven by voter data and what voters were telling us and how we could make the operation more efficient. So once we did all that, we were able to reduce costs and increase turnout. And now Colorado is one of the leading states in terms of voter engagement, top voter registration percentage state, and also one of the most secure places to vote. So it's really an honor to be a part of this group, and it's also great to hear how many local election officials are there, because I think it's, being one myself for a long time, I think it's critically important to make sure that the process and the laws and the policies work for local election administrators. Thanks.
Thanks, Amber. Natalie?
Hello, everyone. I'm Natalie Tennant. I am the manager for state advocacy for the Brennan Center for Justice. And I help to advocate for automatic voter registration, from the work of legislation and helping to craft legislation on through the implementation, and how both of those obviously have to complement each other. Before I had the honor of being at the Brennan Center, I was Secretary of State of West Virginia for 8 years, where we had a lot of bold initiatives too, and part of that was implementing online voter registration and making it easier for deployed military members to be able to vote. And then my last year, we had automatic voter registration passed in West Virginia in a bipartisan effort with Republican majority and Democrats signing, the governor signing it, and still working to make sure they implement it. Elections have consequences, as you know. It's an honor to be on this committee, as everyone has talked about. I'm getting to hear some of my colleagues that I work with a lot on the national level, and then also have the opportunity to hear from local folks, so I appreciate that. And as a person who is headquartered out of West Virginia and on conference calls a lot, I need everyone to talk into the microphone. If not, for those of you who have your cell phones, I'll be texting you and asking you to make sure somebody else beside you is using the microphone, or I might have to interrupt so I can hear. I wanted to be there in person, but the weather just got me. I went to 2 airports and had 2 cancellations, so it's good to be on here, but please use the mic.
Thanks, Natalie. Robin?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Robin Troyer. I'm the city clerk and deputy city manager in the city of Sault Ste. Marie, which is way up as far north as I-75 will take you in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So I'm appreciative that I can phone in today and instead of making the 5-hour trip to Detroit for the in-person meeting. So thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on the phone?
Justin is on.
Oh, Justin Roebuck?
Good morning, guys. Justin Roebuck, I'm the Ottawa County Clerk, and also the co-chair of the Michigan Council of Election Officials and co-chair of the Association of County Clerks Legislative Committee as well. I got my start in elections when I was a pretty young kid, learning from some great people who are at the meeting right now, Chris Thomas and Sally Williams, and learned a lot along the way from Joe Roselle. And I've served as election director for 6 years in Ottawa County before I became county clerk. I've been county clerk for about 6 years now as well. And just honored to be part of this group. I think it's really an exceptional opportunity for us to be able to be in the same room with some folks from just a wide variety of experience. I'm really looking forward to hearing some of that national input as well. And I do apologize for not being there today. I'm headed out on an international trip a little bit later this afternoon, and somewhat related to elections, but just prevented me from being here in person. So.
Thanks, Justin. Anyone else on the phone? Great. One other thing I just want to mention as we move forward, I'm very moved and inspired by all the clerks who are here today. I know, particularly for those of you who have May elections, you've got a lot on your plate, so thank you. But you're also here selected as a representative of your community. I wish we could have had every single of our 1,600 clerks here today, but we know that wasn't practical. So we intentionally selected you based on where you are geographically, your background, your expertise, your commitment to this work, and also the unique perspectives you have to share. But please see yourself also as a representative, not just of the communities you serve, but the clerk community as a whole. So we hope that you will interact with them, engage with them, and continue to get their input as well, so that they all know that they're a part of this too through you. And in relation to that, we also have an election security task force that we'll be announcing in a week that will be focused particularly on election security issues and capturing not just the post-election audit piece, but other aspects and vulnerabilities of the security of our system. So some of you may hear from us on that piece as well, but that will be focused on the security piece, and David Becker will be co-chairing that. So that is also working in tandem and in parallel to this. And the last thing I'll just say is in reflections on all that you've shared, is that I really hope this committee can make recommendations to us that are both bold and detailed. I want you all to think big, strategically, but boldly. Implementing Proposal 3 is not for us just about doing the bare minimum. It's about taking the best practices from around the country and thinking, how does Proposal 3 help us get us to a system where voting is convenient and secure for every single one of our citizens, but also be detailed. Do we need what details, what minutia do we need to consider, from how do we improve poll worker training and perhaps partner with places like Honigman and others to get us good poll workers? How do we not neglect that important piece down to the details of, how do we order absentee ballots and when do we start counting them? In relation to all of those things, I want us to think through not just from the perspective of what does the law currently allow us, but what should the law allow us to do? Because if coming out of this becomes a legislative agenda, then we'll push for that as well with the help and involvement of all of you, or investment of your brain power. So I hope we think not just in terms of, although we do need to think in terms of implementation, but also where we run up against areas in which the law may not be written in such a way to allow us to call something a certain thing or do something a certain way. Let's come up with a list of legislative changes, big and small, that we need to start advocating for. I'll be testifying in front of the House Elections Committee on Wednesday and beginning the work with them to ensure that we continue to push the envelope in things that Proposal 3 did not include, like pre-registration of 16-year-olds, or the details of minutia of implementing a system that has more people voting from home than ever before, like enabling us to start counting those ballots earlier, and also providing more resources for our clerks so that you can move, not just move resources off the front lines on election day to counting those ballots, but other things as well. Do we need to, what sort of nitty-gritty do we need to provide in terms of resources, and does the law allow it? And if it doesn't, then let's push to change it. So I hope we can think in those terms as well. And then the last thing I'll just say is that to us, this is the implementation of these changes and the work that we need to do is partially about policy and legal and the minutia and the rules and the implementation, administration, but it's also about culture. That we have an opportunity for our state to become a state where citizens, to the extent that they already are, even more engaged, even more seeing more ownership of their government. So what can we do to get people thinking about, to get our citizens thinking about more than just now I can vote from home or vote early, but what do I really want to be able to do to make voting convenient, and see it as something that's even a bigger civic responsibility and part of bigger civic engagement. On that piece, I'll just mention before turning it over to our chair, that one of the things we'll be doing at the department in the months ahead under the leadership of Loida and Hester and others is identifying the precincts in this state, the top 100 precincts or 50 precincts where the turnout is the lowest, and going there and talking with citizens. Many of these precincts are in your communities, so we'll be partnering with you on that, I hope. But just talking to voters in a meaningful, open-ended way about what we can do better, listening to them, hearing their response, so that we're not just focused on what policies do we need to change to move the needle on turnout and engagement, but how do we work to create a culture of civic engagement in our state that makes us, again, a model for the rest of the country. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and giving us your background. So this is designed to give you some information, and then we will really move into a lot of discussion. It's not designed just for us to talk at you. So the way this will play out is I'm going to just do a little bit on Proposal 3, just kind of walk through the points that were enacted, and then we'll turn it over to the Bureau, and they are going to give you some information, but each piece is going to be for open discussion. So that is what we are here for, is to hear from you. So you each have a packet, and in your packet you will find agenda, list of the advisory committee members, the welcome memo, which I really urge you to take a good look at when you have an opportunity, and it lays out where we're headed, some issues on transparency. As you know, this is being videotaped. So a record is being made, so just be aware of that. And then also there is a sheet that, a one-page sheet that deals with Proposal 3 that lays out the exact wording. And then we have two pieces, well, maybe one piece of legislation that was enacted in the lame duck session last December that deals with the some of the implementation of Proposal 3. So with that, I'll make one aside if I could. So this is a very historic building, as many of you know. This is where GM was headquartered. Well, my experience with this building was in 1985 when we did a recount of the city of Detroit's mayoral election. And the courts had ordered the Secretary of State to take possession of all the ballots. And they were in Secretary Benson's office now. We had all the ballots from that election in there. I think it was 500 and some precincts plus all the AVs. There was round-the-clock security with police officers from the day before Thanksgiving until almost New Year's. So it was very interesting around here. Now, you probably won't get this opportunity, but if anyone offers you, take it. There is this fabulous freight elevator that they used to bring the cars up here to the conference room. They were the models for the next year. They weren't a full car, but they were a partial car. And if you've ever been in an elevator that has no sides to it, it's a very interesting ride. So we were moving ballots up and down for about a month. It was a lot of fun. So with that aside, I'm going to just walk through the Proposal 3. I will say that I moved back to Michigan in 1977 and started with the Bureau. So that limited any political activity that I ever had as an adult to basically yelling at the TV, right? So I could say nothing public beyond that. So this past election, I had an opportunity to actually take a position publicly on the Promote the Vote, and found very good friends in the ACLU who used to sue me all the time. And we had great synergy on where this all needed to go. And my hat is off to them, Carrie Moss, and Sharon, for really getting this up and off the ground. It was a great time. And I also endorsed a candidate. It's my first candidate I've ever endorsed this year. So that was, yes, that was my
Everyone pleasure. was like, really? No one knew what to make of it.
Yeah. They're like,
Chris Thomas is endorsing someone?
So that was good fun as well. So this proposal is full of things that, as Joe and Nick have indicated, that people have been working for many, many years. Like I indicated to someone this morning, we started working on no reason absentee balloting in 1990. It was the first time we had a bill in the legislature and actually trying to push that through. And so it finally took the people of the state of Michigan to weigh in to do this. So using the sheet that's in your packet, I'm just going to walk through this real quickly, just to stay at a high level, just so we all have kind of an understanding of what we're dealing with. So this is set up as a proposal that provides rights to voters. And I thought that was a very clever way to basically state these. And so it starts out, and these letters is how they follow in the proposal itself. So A provides for a secret ballot, and while everybody kind of takes that as a given, the Constitution prior to that and currently still tells the legislature that they need to enact laws to preserve the secrecy, but there is no specific right to a secret ballot that was ever provided. So that was added. B deals with military and overseas voters, a critical area. It does parallel some of the federal legislation and some of Michigan's legislation dealing with 45 days in advance of the election, ballots will be transmitted. It's nice to have this as a right in the Constitution. Legislation can change. Constitution's not quite so much. And then the third is straight party voting, which is C, which some of you from around the country may find that to be a strange reform in that very few states still have straight party voting. But Michigan likes their straight party voting. There have been 3 attempts to eliminate it, one in the 60s, which was then a referendum petition filed, and the voters overwhelmingly reinstated. In 2002, it was also eliminated. It was on the 2002 ballot. Voters again overwhelmingly said, we want our straight party voting. In 2015, it was again repealed, but a device was used, which is an appropriation was put into the bill, which stopped any referendum petition. So that's how it's found its way here. Michigan has extremely long ballots. I would dare say about as long and probably longer than just about any state. In a presidential election, we're going from president down to township officials. And we've got counties in between. There are cities now. So we have 3 elections a year. We start with May, which there are no real offices up in May. It's kind of a catch-can for proposals and vacancies and maybe recalls. But we then end up in November. And in November general election, even year, is where we elect almost every office in the state, including school boards, with the exception of some cities that still are in the odd year. And they are starting to move, been given authority to move. So our straight party ticket is something that people hang on to. In Michigan, you can vote straight party. You can vote a split ticket, which means you can pick a party. You can move to a candidate and another party. That's fine, and that'll count. Or you can do the mixed ticket, which is not selecting straight party and just voting down the ballot. So that is included in there and is a very popular. D deals with automatic voter registration. That was probably, I don't know, Sharon, you're out there, one of the more difficult explanations. The word automatic really caught people. It's like, well, what do you mean automatic? Are you checking for citizenship? Are you doing any of that? And that was always, part of the explanation, is it means opt out. And citizenship and all those other aspects that previously were checked will continue to be checked. There's nothing different there. The National Voter Registration Act for agency registration actually has this as an opt-out. An application there is a voter registration application unless they sign declining to register. For motor voter purposes, the statute is not opt-out. It just says if the application isn't signed, then it's not a registration. So this goes in the same direction, and basically that the agencies are, and says you will be a registered, this will be a registration application unless you say in writing you don't want to. And so that is a big step here. It gives the benefit of an error by a clerk in the branch offices to the voter. So if, for example, in years past, you will notice a lot of them didn't get signed because of where it was in the process. This will make sure that voter's registered, and I think is going to see a nice tick up in our registration rate, not like many of the other states that have implemented this, because Michigan's already in the 80 percentiles of our registrations coming through the branch office. But there will be some definite increases. Subsections E and F work together. This moves our 30-day close of registration. E moves it for mail registrations to 15 days before. So we're picking up 15 days there that mail registrations can continue to be taken. It bears note, and staff will talk about this in more detail, the residency requirement remains at 30 days. And that's sort of a self-certified when they sign their applications. F is the more complicated, probably the longer paragraph there. So it moves to the 15 days for essentially the in-person registrations. So dealing in the branch offices, agencies, there is, and even in the clerk offices, it's kind of a standard, kind of like the regular 30-day close of registration, is now 15 days. But then For the clerk's offices, the party continues. So for the 14 days from the close to election day, you can register in the clerk's office. And they define this as the clerk, meaning the person who's in charge of the voter registration files, which are city and townships here. And so they will take it. There is a requirement that proof of residence needs to be shown, and that was addressed in some of the legislation and will likely be talked about in more detail. And then finally, the thing that was never ever going to happen in Michigan, that I would have bet and lost, is the fact that we now have an election day registration element. And that is a major safety net for anybody who has missed a deadline, for anybody who's been taken off the files, either correctly or incorrectly. Here is an opportunity to make sure that you still have an opportunity to cast a vote. The way this is written, it appears that it will be in the clerk's offices, not in the precincts as it is in some other states. And again, the Bureau will talk a little bit more in detail about how that might work going forward. And it also says that somebody who does register in the 14 days and on election day shall immediately be eligible to receive an absentee ballot. So that sets that up as well. So looking at G, this is the one that we've been after for years and years, decades. No reason absentee voting, more commonly referred to as voting at home, which I think is going to be seen as a way, as the word gets out to the electors, that they can avoid precincts on election day. I think the numbers are going to increase here. We currently are about 27%, around 1.3 million who vote absentee on our general elections. I would see over the years, and I would bet 2020 is going to be an opportunity for a significant increase in the number of absentee ballots. So, and it also states that the voter can choose, whether, when applying for the ballot, whether, they can do that by mail or in person. So it made it very clear that they can apply and receive the ballot in person or by mail. So this originally is written, you'll see a 40-day period in there, which caused some consternation to me anyway, trying to figure out how that was going to work. Sharon knows that would probably be a tough thing, because what happens at that 40th day? Well, our legislature, through whatever, good works, I'll say, eliminated the reasons entirely, where a narrow reading of this proposal would say the reasons are only eliminated in the 40 days prior to an election. But the legislature has entirely eliminated reasons, which makes that piece of it much easier to implement. City and township clerks have legislatively gotten a little relief, as I understand it, on the Saturday for absentee balloting, but have picked up 8 additional hours over the weekend prior to the election, which they must be available to receive absentee ballots and issue them. And then clerks may make more than one place available. They're required to have one place that in business hours, that somebody is there to take applications and issue ballots. But they can have, by this proposal, additional offices of which this is done. And then the post-election bill, which is basically will be dealt with, or post-election audits will be dealt with in the security task force. But just to note that Michigan has had performance audits, and staff may give a few comments today about the pilots. I know Chris was involved in a pilot, Kalamazoo and Rochester,
Yeah,
Rochester Hills. Tina, we're all involved in the 3 pilots, the risk limiting audit. So the step has been made. There's legislation in your packet. These audits are dealt with and give good authority to the secretary to set procedures. So Michigan has joined that league now of really looking at ballots during those post-election audits. So with that, I just wanted to make sure that overview was there, and I think we are now ready to, has somebody joined us or left us? Has someone joined us on the phone?
Yeah, hi Chris, sorry, it's Tammy, sorry for being so late.
It's okay. Tammy Patrick's from the Democracy Fund. You want to say something about yourself, Tammy?
Oh, hi, I am always late, usually not this late. My apologies. Okay, that was
Tammy,
more of
you're-
a laugh line than I had intended it to be. So Chris and I were on the PCEA together. I'm thrilled to be part of this esteemed organization and in helping out. I do apologize today. There were so many conflicts with my schedule. I had my fingers crossed that the second date was going to be the date of the meeting, which was wide open. So apologies for popping in and out of the call. I'll try not to be disruptive.
Thanks, Tammy. And refresh my memory, you are the former clerk of Maricopa County in Arizona? Long time
Yeah,
clerk?
so I was the federal compliance officer in Maricopa County, which meant that when we were under, I still say we, it's been 5 years, and I still say we.
So do
when
I.
we were under the Voting Rights Act, under Section 5, I did all of our submissions to DOJ and oversaw all of the language assistance program in Spanish and an unwritten Native American language of the Tohono O'odham, and then also did all of our voter assistance for alternative formats, so Braille, audio, and large print, and oversaw our community network outreach organization.
And then you served on the Presidential Commission for Election Administration, and you're now with the Democracy Fund. Did I got that?
Correct.
All right.
Yes, I'm
Thanks
a
for
senior
joining us.
advisor to the Democracy Fund, where we're continuing some of the efforts outlined in the PCEA through granting to a variety of grantees and organizations around the country, as well as contracting work, doing things on work such as Jennifer Morell working on risk limiting audits, or John Gerlai, I should say, John Gerlai working on common data formats and election process models. So they're really wonky, weedy stuff.
Tammy, you have to mention your work with Postal.
And also voting at home? Or voting by mail?
Yeah, so I have represented the election official population, I guess, with the Postal Service as Election Center's liaison to the Mailers Technical Advisory Committee, which is a group of around 100 or 150 individuals that represent all of the various associations and industry leaders that rely on the Postal Service, so everything from periodicals to credit card billing mailers. And I've represented Election Center as a representative to the MTAC committee for probably a little bit more than a decade now. So have been tasked with some of the efforts with the Postal Service. In tandem with Democracy Works, we created something called electionmail.org, and it's a channel where election officials can report issues that they're having with their local post office or with the local information that they're receiving. And then I must say that Michigan is the #1 user of electionmail.org. They comprise more than half of the reports, for better or worse. Although the numbers are dwindling, so I hope that means that things are getting better. And we've also been able to convince the Postal Service that in the ballot tracking in the IMB, the intelligent mail barcode that's used for tracking packages and ballots, that we need something specifically for ballots themselves. So last year they agreed to create a service type ID, so they will now know when ballots are actually in their processing plants, and we'll be able to locate them more quickly and make sure that they're being processed in a timely way.
Thanks, Tammy. That'll be really helpful, and I think particularly for our clerks here to connect on that. And I think, as we now hear from Sally on kind of where we are on different types of reforms, I want to emphasize that I think moving forward with the rest of our discussion today, I see it really is collating around 3 areas. First is voter registration. Whether it's automatic voter registration or, for the lack of better words, same-day voter registration, and the registering closer to Election Day and all those pieces. What do you all need on that to make that happen? What should we be doing to make that happen? What do we need to change the law to make that happen? Secondly is the early voting and no reason absentee voting piece. Voting from home, however we call it, but also being able to vote early, getting our clerks time to process those. So that is the second. And then third, voter education. None of these changes will really move the needle if voters don't know they can take advantage of these changes. So how do we work with you all, and how do you advise us that we work to ensure our voters are educated? And I'll say we don't believe in the model of just putting out press releases and hoping that it makes its way to a voter's home or computer. We actually want to go to where the voters are and say these are the opportunities, and so what can you all advise us on in terms of educating voters about these changes? So as we move forward in sort of those 3 buckets and seek your advice and feedback on all 3, we thought it would be helpful for Sally Williams to share with us kind of where the Bureau of Elections currently is on those areas. And I should have mentioned the education piece is not just voters, it's clerks and election administrators and poll workers as well. Education broadly defined.
Okay, just a couple minutes, wanted to kind of lay some groundwork for what we have been doing to try to get ourselves ready and everybody else ready in the state for the implementation of Proposal 3. As it's been mentioned, we have an election on May 7th. Fortunately, I think for us, it's the smallest election in the cycle, but as we found now is the only kind of smaller date, we have a lot more participation. So we're already into getting ready for our May election. We've got just over 500 jurisdictions who will be represented in one way, shape, or form. So even though small, it's not that small. Mary Clark mentioned she is an opt-out with Chris Swope. We have another unique piece here in Michigan in these May elections, which will be, I think, also a very good test for all these pieces of Proposal 3, in that these are often school millages, and we have school lines that don't always completely match up with our local jurisdiction lines, and also they're not very high turnout typically, unfortunately. But what our locals will do is they do partner, and you have school coordinators that sometimes take on the precincts of neighboring jurisdictions that are in their school districts. And we've already found some interesting discussion points on the implementation of Proposal 3 as it affects this consolidated model in Michigan. So again, it's a good test. But for just a couple of minutes, where we started with the Bureau of Elections with these concepts really was to bring our own staff together. For those that work with us regularly, you know we have a technical staff who makes changes to our qualified voter file and our e-poll book programs and our data people. We have other election specialists that are more policy oriented and just training oriented. So we started by bringing all of the staff together for several days. Actually, it was a great suggestion by staff with facilitated sessions by some other state employees. It's called the Lean Process Improvement, LPI, but really mapping things out end to end, looking at the constitutional amendment, looking at the legislation that went through in lame duck, really focused in on voter registration and the absentee voting process as it was, mapped out in great detail, and then how it will be based on what we know today, and really highlighting those pockets of change, highlighting some of the odd scenarios or things that may need further exploration. And so we did that for a few reasons, both to get all of our staff on the same page, talking through these scenarios, and really getting everybody on our end educated, and then also just starting with an initial plan on now what? I heard Secretary Benson say that that's kind of one of our goals here, and it's a term that's near and dear to my heart for anybody who's heard me speak lately. I had a sign on my door for most of last year saying, now what and what else? Always thinking about those terms, what else? So we have used that exercise to create an initial communication plan, training plan, what resources do we need to update, and getting the full word out. And again, initial word based on our initial reading. So again, this timing is great here. And for those clerks in the room and on the phone, you may have seen already, just last week, we started with our first major communication on the implementation of Proposal 3 that was focused in on voter registration changes. It linked to our updated clerk manuals on these issues. And then the next series will be focused on absentee voting and some of those changes there. And then a week later, you're going to see one more communication on everything else about Proposal 3. For those not part of the clerk community, we try very hard to communicate often, on a regular schedule, but in manageable amounts to our clerk world. There's a lot of nitty-gritty and devil in the details here, but we try very hard to communicate things regularly and at a time where it's important that messages come to the top. So you'll see us do these 3 series of communications, and then as we get closer to our May election and say our 14-day window out, which is near the end of April, you'll start to see these reminders of what we've already communicated. We've also gotten to work on what I think I'm calling will be a living frequently asked questions document that, based on what all we're hearing, what questions are coming up, will be posted and out there for the clerks as well as the voters, as well as an online training course specific to Proposal 3. And then we're talking about doing some regional sessions all around the state. Again, we're focused on May, but these are changes everyone's going to need to be up to speed on it. And those of you lucky enough to have a May election and get to experiment first, will be the first time out. But everyone needs to get up to speed on quite a few things. So we will be out and around the state probably quite a bit this year, answering questions, getting more input. And then after May, hopefully getting much more feedback. Because the other part of this, and our exercise in doing this lean process improvement, was to put together then some follow-up groups on policy, procedure, but also measurement. A lot of you here deal with data. We've got a renewed focus on data. We really want to collect a lot of data, not just feedback on how things are going, but data on what we're seeing and measuring these changes and what additional resources and help and communications need to come there. So that is really where we're at right now. And again, the timing here I think is great because I think we've got a shell model going. And it's time, I think, to just start to put some of this information out and talk about it even further, and then get that feedback along with our messaging and our training and the way we are handling this all around the state.
Okay. Questions, comments? Chelsea?
So, Shelley, we did the same thing that you all did in terms of come together and look at and compare. And one thing we didn't see in the information provided is this. If an individual, let me just go back. So now individuals can register on election day and then vote in their offices, correct?
Correct.
Okay. If an individual is already registered, will they be allowed to vote in our offices and satellite facilities as well, if they're already registered? Is that a yes?
Not after the absentee validation.
We should, I think we should tackle some of these. There's a part on registering to vote that day and voting in your office. And then there are still some existing deadlines on absentee voting if you are already registered and not changing your registration. And I think as we go through some of these scenarios, we need to talk those out.
Because the other part of that question, go ahead. Who was that?
And this is Amber. I just wanted to throw in there, we sort of experienced that nuance in Colorado for a while when we had to offer certain registration elements and could only do it at one office. And it created actually a lot of confusion, which is why we actually ended up, part of the reason we went forward with the model we have, which is vote centers, and you can do same-day registration, voting, all of that at any of them. And I know, obviously, Michigan has polling places, but I think in terms of Secretary Benson's idea to kind of look farther down the road, it might be something to work towards, because that nuance actually does create a lot of operational problems, or can, because it's just confusing for voters to understand if they can, go to the clerk's office or not, regardless of whether or not they're registered.
I was just gonna say, I vote New Jersey, which is only, well, the only thing we're ahead of you on is in-person absentee. So they actually create, we got no excuse absentee about 2010, and you're allowed to do in-person absentee in any clerk's office, I think through Sunday. So they have Monday to do the updates for the polling place.
I would just say that 1238, the Senate bill that passed, is full of, a lot of gotchas. I really do believe that it also creates different classes of voters that'll be appearing in clerks' offices. And this is a huge, I think, issue of education with 1,500 local election officials. In near 14 years in this business, this is probably the biggest election reform I think I've seen since we got the school districts out of the election business. Probably that was the last big change of any real substance that we've seen in the election community, and that was back 05 time period. So this is pretty significant. I think the other issue is, like Clerk Winfrey mentioned, she has these satellite facilities that work really well. One of the gotchas at 1238 is now she has to go get approval from her city council to even do that 30 days before. And if that doesn't happen, there's going to be this gotcha, and you're not going to be able to do it. So I think there's all of these things baked into legislation now that we really have to be watchful for and make sure clerks are watchful for, or voters risk being harmed, in these communities. So I think, these are things that I think definitely I'd like to see discussed and in the communication plan as we sort of move forward. And one other thing I'll say too is we need to think, and I'm hoping we can think big picture as far as what requires legislation and what doesn't. And one of the things I'm thinking about is like the vignettes, right? So those came out of law in a way of sort of how they were able to win in the federal courts. And getting them back legislatively is probably a non-starter, but I'm not sure maybe it requires legislation. There's some flexibility at the county level in ballot design. I mean, if we follow the statute in terms of how ballots are supposed to look, we'd have pastel colored ballots and multiple ballots with diagonal cornered stubs and different offices on green ballot is this and a white ballot is that. We don't do that, right? So we're already not following statute for ballot layout. So this may be opportunities where could we work in the vignettes in some administrative capacity rather than go legislative. So I'm trying to think of ways to tackle issues like that where we know we may not make headway one way, could we do it another way?
You've always been creative.
That's right. That's right.
If you all have comments, I'm glad that everyone's participating. Just put your thing like this. Sally and Chris will work to I acknowledge folks. And Lori, I know you were planning to address a lot of these pieces. I don't know if you want to do a brief overview and then we can resume the discussion, because I know it might answer a lot of questions.
Sure, and I wasn't really sure, do we want to do a whole overview or maybe just tackle it a little piece at a time? This is your committee. I am here to help all of you.
But there's a piece on the table which is talking about absentee balloting requests. Janice, correct me if I don't have this correct. that deals with somebody that comes in on election day and registers. And you could have a couple different registrations. It could be brand new to Detroit, right? And then you could have people who are just changing their address within Detroit who've already been registered in Detroit. And the question is how,
We're not changing it up.
Already just registered
Oh,
and
just
don't want to
showing
go
up to vote
to their
AV.
polling location. Instead, they want to go to either one of my satellites
I see.
or how do we?
And they should be entitled to an absentee ballot at that time, right? How do you-
if they're registering.
If,
yeah.
so.
But only if you're registering, can you
Yeah.
get it in the law?
I think Joe's right. I think that's one of the gotchas in the
Yep.
law.
Yep.
Yeah, because we couldn't find it in the law specifically, and so we just don't know.
So you'll have those satellites open for registering folks.
For registering and voting and receiving their absentees,
Right.
yes. But what if an individual says, I want to vote an absentee ballot, I'm already registered, I've been registered, I want to vote.
Can on election day. Can on
Yeah,
election
go
day.
ahead,
They have to go
Laura.
to precinct.
So, but
In
does it say-
1238, the legislation that was passed to implement Proposal 3, it specifically states, this clerk of the city or township shall not issue an absent voter ballot to a registered elector in that city or township after 4 p.m. on the day before an election. So if the legislation says that that person cannot be issued a ballot, I think a conversation, though, is what does the Constitution allow? Because the legislation can't take away something that the Constitution has allowed. Which also goes back to Joe's point about having having to have the city or township board approve a satellite office. I believe that conflicts with the Constitution and something that we should be discussing.
On section G of the amendment, it says the right to vote an absent voter ballot during the 40 days prior to election.
So they can still vote it, this is a limitation on how you get it. Well,
But the
Except
section
it's the
also
right
says
this is the
and
right
do
to get
it.
it, yep, yep.
So we have Nick and we have Sharon.
Yep.
So we'll do a round of questions, then Lori, if you wanted to maybe do an overview presentation.
But that is a major point. One of the biggest concerns I had of 1238 was this requirement that you could only register at the clerk's office on election day. And the reason that concerned me was that, having worked with the voter protection program over the years, one of the biggest problems we had was people trying to figure out which precinct they belonged and so forth and so on. We always knew that if you ask people to move from one place to another, that you're going to lose some along the way. And turnout is even a bigger problem than voter registration in Michigan, as it is throughout the country. So we didn't want to lose them. We didn't want to have them lose their ability to vote. The way 1238 read to me said that I can, if I'm already registered to vote, I can vote. Right now, or before the change, it was 2 o'clock on Saturday before the election, and then you'd have to go to an emergency ballot otherwise. Now it's 4 o'clock on the day before. That's good. But it said if I wanted to register to vote, I could register to vote on election day, but only at the clerk's office. And prior to that, I could have done my AD ballot, but now I've got to go under 1238 back to the precinct to vote rather than voting right at the same time that I registered to vote. That's a concern because, as I said, you're going to lose people as they're moving back and forth. I think I'm hearing you say that that may be a constitutional problem, number one. And number two, I would reinforce that as being a constitutional problem because of the very specific language in Prop 3 that says the constitutional amendment is self-executing, and you can't go below it. Obviously, you couldn't go below it anyways, but the fact that it's self-executing, and 1238 was built as a implementation bill, I think strengthens the argument I think I heard you make, that said, no, it doesn't count. If you could go to the clerk's office on election day and register and get an AD ballot, and anybody else could, unless you were already registered, might as well go to the precinct. You're only going one place that way, right?
So 1238 actually allows for you to register and vote an absentee or ballot on election day.
Oh.
So 1238 allows for that. What 1238 doesn't allow is someone to go to their clerk's office on election day and get an AD ballot and vote it there. If you're already registered.
Oh, so you're saying that provision that says you can't issue an absentee ballot on election day doesn't apply to somebody who is registering on
Correct.
election day, but they have to do it at the clerk's office.
We have Sharon and then Elizabeth.
So, yeah, I mean, one of the things, as someone who's been mulling over all of these questions a lot, I think one of the things that I'm hoping will come out of are which of these conflicts we need to deal with immediately, and I'm really looking to my clerk community for that, because just as I was coming here today, I thought, okay, so there's definitely cleanup in the 1238 bill, there's definitely cleanup in the election code writ large, because 1238 didn't even make the changes that it made consistent throughout the election code. But most significantly, this morning was the first time that I realized that you all will be starting to train your poll workers on these. I know, you know that, I'm sorry, I have to admit that. But my greatest concern was the realization that you'll train them, and then we'll fix it, and then you'll have to retrain them. And I think that same concern applies to voters. So one of the things I'm hoping is that we figure out which of these problems, and also figure out which ones really desperately, as someone who does have legislative staff in Lansing, need to be fixed before we roll out a whole implementation process and start educating voters and our election officials on a process that isn't going to stick around through 2020 or isn't maybe going to stick around until August. So I just put that out there because I do have legislative staff and want to partner with others about trying to make some quick changes if they need to be made quickly.
I just wanted to put some numbers behind the discussion that our school precincts are not even in Michigan. In Livingston, we have a small May election. We have 3 ballot proposals, and I have one school jurisdiction that has 9 voters in a township where the bulk of them those voters belong in the main school district, Howell precinct. So when we talk about Michigan is very unique, I have 9 voters now that a clerk is going to have to be open on those 8 hours over the weekend before to serve those potential voters. And then to show you another spectrum, I have another jurisdiction that has 200 voters that under consolidated school agreement plans, those voters are usually serviced by another clerk in a neighboring jurisdiction. So it can be an issue.
I just wanted to highlight one thing that Lori was talking about before about the same-day registration piece, and we need to realize there are some technical limitations in the precinct on election day that includes the QVF and the poll book. They do not talk to each other. I'm not sure that we necessarily want them to talk to each other on election day. And right now, the reason for the 4 p.m. Monday deadline for getting an absentee ballot in person is because that name is downloaded onto the poll book. So presumably a voter could walk into the precinct having already been issued a voter, and the precinct would not know that unless there was some way to communicate that directly with the clerk. So there's a technical issue there.
Related to the voter registration and same-day registration, but a gotcha in 1238, and I know I've already told Lori this, the requirement, if you have anything other than a Michigan driver's license, to challenge, but the Constitution says that voters who register within the 14-day window in person have a right to be issued a regular ballot. And I guess for those of us who anticipate a lot of day 14 up to election day, every single ballot being challenged, they're not going to have a Michigan driver's license with their address. That's why they're registering in the window. So that we see as a huge gotcha, and another, I think I've talked to Sharon about it as well. I don't see that the Constitution says challenge ballot, these are in-person registrations. So that's one that we're concerned about.
One of our questions moving forward is what clarifying instructions can we issue? And what legislative changes do we need to seek, or both, on this? Ben?
I'm sorry?
Oh, did you have your?
Yes. So a major concern of mine, just with respect to some of the legislative changes, is the requirement that if you're registering same day, that you have to do it in the clerk's office. I don't know if this is something that needs to be changed in the law, or if there's some other mechanism to address that, but I'd like it to be so that perhaps it's something as simple as where the precinct inspectors can call the clerk's office and do the registration that way, rather than making the voter travel to the clerk's office. And that's for, obvious reasons, logistically. And then another piece with respect to early voting, no reason, absentee, is where in the law it provides for flexibility for the clerks to provide office hours on either Saturday or Sunday. And I'd like to see that there be some consistency. So I'm not sure exactly how that needs to be prescribed, but so that it's not always changing, so that voters know what they can rely on, at least at a minimum in their local community. Perhaps it's something that should be considered statewide, that should be just consistent, so that it's not a guessing game for people.
Janice?
Yes, so one of the legislative fixes that I would ask that we consider is to allow us to process absentee ballots earlier than the day of election, because we know we're going to get we're going to count at least 100,000 on election day, and we need to be able to process earlier than election day. And the other thing I wanted to get clarification on is, we can't allow a voter to take a ballot out after 2 o'clock on Saturday previously, right? That's changed to what? 5 o'clock Friday. Right. 4 o'clock on Friday.
That's my mail.
That's my mail.
So we can't give them an absentee ballot because.
You can give it to them in person Monday, but you can't mail it to them on Friday.
Right, but on Monday, when we give it to them, if they say, I want to take it and vote it at home, we can't allow them to do that from the old law. What about this law?
Well, we want to update the law to say as long as it's postmarked by election day and received within a certain window of election day, it can
want
still
to
count
do
it. But
that.
right now, it still has to be received by 8 p.m. on election day in order to count.
They can still walk off with it.
They can walk off with it and bring it back. It just has to be under the current law received by 8 p.m. on election. Go ahead.
The law also says, though, that on that Monday before the election, the voter has to vote the ballot in the clerk's office.
Right.
They can't take it home. That's not a change. That was the law previously, and no change was made to that. What we have added, though, are the Saturday and Sunday hours, and I know we've gotten questions as to whether a voter can walk off with the ballot during that Saturday and Sunday, and I don't see any change in the law. To me, the law still just says that Monday, so that on Saturday and Sunday, my own personal opinion is that they should be able to leave Saturday and Sunday with the ballot, because there was no change to that section of the law.
You mean the Saturday and Sunday before election?
Yes. Yeah, the Saturday and Sunday before the election, where you now have to be open for some combination of 8 hours. I don't see anything that put any restrictions. I can't find a restriction that says that a voter can't leave with the ballot during those hours.
What it stopped was the mailing of the ballot on Friday, which
Correct.
used to be 2 o'clock Saturday.
Right,
But the walk-ins can still be issued the ballot on
and they can walk out with them.
Saturday and Sunday.
And
walk
we
it back in
never
when they're
did
done.
because of the
Well, they
the
can
Saturday
return it
2
in
o'clock.
person.
I'm sorry?
They can still return it in person.
Oh, they can return it.
Yeah.
They can return it.
Right, whether it's good or not to take it at that
Right,
point in time is
that's
up to
our
them.
thing.
We have Amber,
Right.
and then David, and Matt. So
Okay.
Amber?
Amber, go ahead.
Yeah, so, listening on the phone, it's sort of interesting because a lot of these conversations were the same ones that we were having in Colorado when we were essentially faced with the same dilemma before we went to our new model. And
So what I was gonna say is, I think if it's confusing for everybody who's in the room, who's clearly experts in various provisions, imagine how confusing it's gonna be for the public, for voters, for anybody who's trying to interact with the system, whether it be candidates or campaigns or anything like that. So I did wanna just, and I know this would take a change in the law, but in particular as it relates to same-day registration, part of the reason that we did what we did was, number one, our circumstances were slightly different in that we had high use of vote-by-mail requests. But I think with your new law, you're probably gonna see that skyrocket, this year and next. And so we ended up going to vote centers primarily to address the same-day registration problem that you're all talking about right now. Because you could go to, you could go to any vote center. We had, real-time e-poll book connectivity, and it eliminated all these confusing provisions that are gonna face you. So I think the caution I have, as we contemplate this is, if we don't address some of the confusing provisions that are clearly in the law right now in Michigan, it's gonna create a lot of administrative hassle for a lot of you next year, because you're gonna get questions from voters. They're gonna show up thinking they can vote at the clerk's office. You're gonna have candidates, campaigns, other groups telling people they can, even though maybe they can't. So I think it's a good example of something that really needs a good solution so that you can avoid, frankly, a lot of the heartburn that we had to deal with prior to going to our old model. And I can guarantee you it's gonna increase probably provisional ballots. You'll have people showing up at the clerk's office that will then have to be told to go to another polling place, and it's gonna be tough for voters and for administrators. So I think it's certainly a good example of something that I would look to states, and Colorado is the most current example of having to implement same-day registration within the last, 5 years, which is what we went to. And California is in the middle of doing that right now, and I think there are certainly some lessons to be learned from those states that have gone through this exact transition.
Thanks.
Thank you. We'll go down the line here, David, Matt, Whitney, and then Joe, and then we'll come back to Lori, and then lunch.
Thanks. So in looking at proposal 3, and especially hearing some of the comments around the table, particularly Jackie, your comments, one of the most powerful things I've seen in this is something that I suspect has Sharon's fingerprints all over it, and is really remarkable because it's rare, which is the statement that this subsection shall be liberally construed in favor of voters' rights. This is something that we sometimes seek to have implicit in how election administration is portrayed. But what this tells me is when a voter shows up in your office, you're supposed to do everything to get to yes, and that you can. And it's going to be our job to figure out how to make that work for all of you. But whether it's the circumstance of someone coming in with a non-Michigan driver's license during the same-day registration period, or something else, regardless of what's in 1238, I think the constitutional provision is really clear. And I know for those of us who are lawyers around this table, that is a very, very powerful provision. And so we're going to have to figure that out in all of these cases. And so Amber's quite right. I mean, most voters, as we know, especially election administrators, they don't know about all of these rules. They don't really care about all of these rules. These rules, to be fair to them, are changing a lot, and it's very difficult for them to keep up with that. So all the research supports the idea that they don't really know how voter registration works. They don't really know how absentee balloting works. They don't, if you ask, the majority of people still don't think that if the election's not close, they wonder whether their absentee ballot's going to be counted, and we know it is. So to be thinking from the voter's perspective, how do we get to yes for them? Even if it's something that the legislature didn't directly address, I think this constitutional provision gives us a lot of power to find a way to get to yes.
I am not a lawyer, so although I'm glad David made that note. I said this when I introduced myself. My background started with civic engagement, and my home state of Montana introduced and has an election day registration system that is a county level system, not a precinct level system. And depending on whether you have moved within the county, whether you are a new voter, whether you've moved within the state from a different county, there's just a lot of different things, or you haven't moved and you're not sure where you go vote. the fact that each of those questions is answered differently means that the canvassers who are out there, whether they're working for candidates or political parties or Americans for Prosperity or Working America or whatever sort of operation, the training, and often with out-of-state field directors who fly into the state, don't know the state very well, means that a lot of people get given bad answers. And so just want to emphasize that I think it is really, really important if we can figure out how to simplify this for voters and for clerks and for everyone else who's going to be out there talking to voters in the next 2 years. One question that's already come up from folks who I told that I was joining this commission was about the possibility of absentee ballot request interfaces that are multi-jurisdictional. So how does someone who is out gathering absentee ballot applications in a high traffic location, how can they make sure that whatever they're gathering will get into a place that will be the correct jurisdiction for that individual to actually get an absentee ballot? There may already be an answer on that, I'm not sure. Something else that has come up that is of interest to me, my background is in youth voting. There's issues with resident students in Michigan who are going to school across the state, probably aren't going to update their driver's license address while they're going to school. This absentee ballot language in the constitutional amendment looks very broad in terms of protecting those students' right to an absentee ballot, which I think has been an issue in the past. I'm curious how we can use this opportunity to sort of address that particular population. And then I thought it was very interesting that in the materials for this meeting, that it was flagged for this question of pre-registration around automatic voter registration. This was an issue in Oregon where they found it first, where they were not including 16 and 17-year-olds in their automatic voter registration system, that there was a major problem with 18 to 20-year-olds basically just being excluded from that process. It's an issue that we're seeing in Colorado data, that pre-registrants are one of the sort of biggest question marks, and that ends up excluding a lot of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds until they go back to the DMV. And the phrasing of the right to be automatically registered to vote as a result of conducting business, that is an interesting phrasing. I don't know how intentional that was, but it doesn't say, you know, when conducting business. It doesn't say at the time of business. It says as a result of. And strikes me that there may be a way to construe that as well liberally, although again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm
I'm also not a lawyer, but I know the Colorado model, and I've been working in California, and so I keep thinking about the differences. So for instance, California has an E+3 for return of absentee ballots. Colorado is, I think, Amber, tell me if I'm correct, election day. But one of the things I don't see in any of these laws is the ability to return ballots to any polling place. So your absentee ballot can be dropped off at a polling place or on election day or at drop boxes around the county. This has actually been really great for people where part of a family has an absentee ballot and part doesn't. People who want to take the time to vote at home but want to show up at a public place to say that they voted, and that's been really helpful. There are states like Virginia where the absentee ballots are actually counted at the precinct, so it's not completely out of line for that. Just in general, I think one of the challenges is in gap analysis is going to be making sure that all the pieces fit together into a whole. I think you've all been alluding to that, but making sure that we think about how we can write the voter education and poll worker and election worker instructions so that it comes out really simple. And that will almost always, for me, trump anything else, because it means that there's fewer challenges with misunderstandings. Just to echo everything everybody said about all of that, that if we don't make it seem simple, it won't be simple. And if it isn't simple, we will have, your phone lines will light up.
Yeah, I would just say that, you know, we talked about, you know, legislative fixes to some of this stuff, and, you know, if past behavior is an indicator of future results, I don't think we're going to get very far, frankly. So, like, what would Plan B be? You know, and I think it's thinking, you know, is Plan B looking at our legal options or pursuing what we think is the right thing under the Constitution and let someone sue, you know, the election community for, you know, doing the right thing by voters? You know, I mean, those are the things we need to talk about, because we can introduce legislation all day long, but we all know, those of us in the clerk community, it's not going to go anywhere with the way the legislature has certainly behaved in the past. So we may want to talk seriously about what our other options are in terms of fixing some of this stuff, because I don't see certain committees taking up some of these bills if they view it as making it easier for voting.
Okay, I think we're kind of bumping up against lunch. I would like to go through sort of the outline of issues that we've spotted at the Bureau. Kind of put it all in your minds. Maybe while we're eating a quick bite, we can think about these things and come back with questions and move on from there. But to quickly go down the line here, David, yes, that provision about liberally construed is one that the Bureau looks at often to see if there's some way we can get to a yes. The 18 to 20 demographic, we've already identified as an issue too, because kids have to come in, not even maybe when they're 18, they come in at 17, and then they're not required to come into the branch office again until they're 21, perhaps. And then, I'll move on. I had a comment for Whitney, but I can't remember what it is. All right. One of the big changes is the voter registration deadline. We used to have a 30-day registration deadline. Now what we have is a 15-day, not in person with the clerk, voter registration deadline. People can still register to vote in those other ways, at a branch office, at a designated state agency, or by mail in those 15 days. You still need to register them to vote, but they don't become eligible for that election unless they show up at their clerk's office during that time period. So one of the things that we've been working on, you have this document that says draft on it. This would be a receipt. The branch, the designated state agencies, and a clerk who receives something by mail in those last 0 to 14 days would need to notify that voter that while they are registered to vote, they are still not eligible to vote in that next election. So we need to let them know. The closer you get to the election date, the more important it is that you reach out to that voter in any way possible and not just rely on mailing them a receipt. But there will be one, they all will look sort of like this, or whatever this committee decides they should look like, or the secretary when she gives her input, but they'll just have a little bit different language depending on which agency took the registration. Speaking of registering at the branch with this automatic voter reg, the blue and white forms are going to change. Right now that's a voter registration form, and instead it's just going to turn more into a voter receipt, and then we need to discuss whether or not clerks believe you should even get a blue and white any longer if you need to get something from the branch office. Starting in that 14th day before the election, we've already talked about voting in person at the clerk's office. What does that mean? What is the clerk's office? Does it just need to be someplace where the clerk has access to QVF and a printer to print a receipt for the voter? What if the clerk does all of their work out of their home normally? What if that's where voters know to go to find them? Do they have a computer? Do they have a printer? What about clerks that don't normally do their own voter registration and have the counties help them? The 1238 says that it's their own local clerk that has to be able to register them to vote, which is what brings us the opt-out issue. Voters now have to have a proof of residency when they vote within those last 0 to 14 days. What does that look like? Can it be electronic? Can I show you my utility bill on my phone? Is that good enough? We think it is. And again,
Laura, I'm sorry.
Sure.
Can you just break it down for us? What happens 15 days, what happens 0 to 14, what happens the election, the weekend before?
Yep, up to the 15th day prior, it's like it is now. You can register at a branch office, you can register with your clerk, you can register at a designated state agency or by mail. That's what happens up to 15 days is what used to happen up to 30 days.
With no proof of residency.
With no proof of residency, correct. Starting in the 14th day prior to the election, you must register in person with your clerk, your local clerk. And you have to have some sort of proof of residency. And that's really the same for election day.
Still needs to be clarifying what is acceptable, what is not, and
Correct.
we'll be doing rulemaking or issuing instructions around that.
It's in the law. I believe it's the HAVA ID requirements, basically utility bill, government check, yeah. But,
I
yep,
think
and I
that-
turn.
That'll be a good discussion after lunch, that we can lay that out in some real detail and then get some reaction to it.
Yes. And then registering with in person with your local clerk on election day, the difference there is that if you are registering, you can also get an AV ballot on election day. And it appears that the 1238 doesn't allow that to happen to someone who isn't currently registered, or who is already currently registered to vote. I will point out that the legislation actually says it has to be somebody who moves into your jurisdiction, but we believe that again conflicts with the Constitution. Even if we're going to say it has to be a new registrant, I think it can be even somebody who moves within your jurisdiction and has to perform a new registration on that day, even though 1238 limits it to new registrants to your jurisdiction.
As we're going in, just a couple more things. Matt, you had raised the point about the problem that college students and others who have moved are having voting absentee back in the park committee. Under the new constitutional amendment, which gives everyone the right, once registered, to vote by absent ballot, we've notified the clerks that that's unenforceable, so that people can vote absentee as soon as they're registered. There is still a hover requirement for identification for first-time voters registered by mail, but not the other piece of having to vote in person. And then the other thing that we need to think about, that Lori covered everything very well, but there's also the specific issue of the people who do register on election day, but then they decide they do want to go down to the polling place and vote. And how do we handle that? Because some people will just want to go down and vote. So we have worked with our forms committee on some ways to address that at the polling place, but that's another implementation and design and also education component that I think we should think about.
So, in the most spoken person, we've taken off the language on the form. That's the other form you have, is the new voter registration form. It has the new time frame on it, and it also now just talks about the federal ID requirement.
So we're gonna break for lunch. You have received these forms that we've referenced for you to kind of look over informally. We've got, just out the doors there on the right, some lunch available, so we'll break for how long?
Well, we're bringing it back in here.
So 5 minutes and then come back?
Yeah, come back in.
People need to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, maybe
No, I mean-
10.
We have one bathroom, so we
Okay.
should give people 10
Why don't we figure we won't start talking
We've got
for another
elections to run.
about 15 minutes, okay?
So we'll
Get your
reconvene in
lunch.
about 15 minutes.
Get into it, just a housekeeping issue. If you're on the phone and you'd like to ask a question, you cannot raise your hand, or you can, but we will not see it. And so if you could text Sally Marsh, she's going to read off her phone, just text her if you want to ask a question.
And I'll add you to the queue. So my number is 517-599-5347.
And to clarify, just text her that you want to ask a question. You don't have to text your question to her. This is not a Twitter town hall.
Yes.
Also, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge the staff that's helping preserve this in the terms of videotape. So Walter Marshall, thank you. You got here early to set everything up. And Josh, Josh McAlpine, who works in the Elections Bureau, who's up here in this camera. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So Chris is going to get us back into our program here. Just a note on our discussion and the way we're going through things. You know, these are sort of the concepts as the secretary articulated them that we have to be thinking about from the voter's perspective. We have laid out the agenda to try to organize our discussion a little bit, to talk first about the voter registration and same-day registration issues, then the absent voter ballot issues, then AVR, and then outreach. And so we're going to try to go through those in sequence with our discussion. But keeping these concepts in mind because they really do cut across a lot of the different areas. So that's just to try to provide some structure, understanding that, you know, we're going to be talking about some things that overlap.
Okay, Lori's going to continue, and she's going to talk about the 14-day to zero, which she's calling election day. And she'll give us more information on that. As part of that, we'll talk a little bit about registering on election day and what it's going to look like in the clerk's office when that happens and the interaction with the QVF. And then we will move on from there, as Jonathan indicated. Lori?
All right, so in that 0 to 14-day period, which includes election day, a voter was going to come to the clerk's office to register to vote. It's really important that everybody's on QVF refresh at this point in time, because you can see that voter when you pull them up. You can see if they're registered somewhere else in Michigan. You can see if they've been issued an AD ballot somewhere else. You can see if they've returned an AD ballot in a different jurisdiction. And the closer we get to election day, the more important these things become. So the voter comes in and registers, you put them in QVF, and now there is this residency verification requirement. Now, Michigan has a 30-day, there's two concepts here. Michigan has a 30-day residency requirement. You have to live in the jurisdiction 30 days prior to the election to be able to vote in the election. This used to be taken care of by our 30-day registration cutoff. So if you registered within 30 days before the election, you were going to live there for 30 days. The residency piece now is not something you have to investigate. The voter just has to show you proof of residency. They don't have to show you that they've lived there 30 days. They don't have to prove they've been at a particular address. They just have to show you proof of residency, which is one of the HAVA documents, I believe. Utility bill, government check, those types of issues, a paycheck. There is a self-certification on the voter registration application. It says on the application, I have lived in the jurisdiction or will have lived in the jurisdiction for 30 days. That's all they need to do is sign that for the 30-day piece. Now, when I come in to register to vote, I can show my Michigan driver's license or personal ID card with my current address on it. That serves as both identification and proof of residency because my driver's license has my current address on it. As I believe Jackie pointed out earlier, that might not happen very often because hopefully when those people change their driver's license address, their voter registration got updated and those people are registered to vote. These would be people who have a driver's license or an ID, haven't been to the branch office in this year, and are not registered to vote. The second, and those people get issued they can be issued a Navy ballot or a regular ballot on election day. If they show up with a Michigan driver's license or ID without their current address, then they need to show one of these proofs of residency. That voter is issued a ballot that is marked as challenged or processed as challenged. They could come in and have other picture ID, anything on our list, a school ID, things that are ID that's valid for election purposes, the school ID, a passport,
Military ID.
Tribal ID. Yeah, it's this tribal ID, it's that same list. And proof, they would still have to have proof of residency. Then they would be issued a ballot that's processed as challenged. They could come in and have no picture ID and sign the affidavit that says, I don't have my ID, and show proof of residency. And those people would be issued a ballot that would be processed as challenged. If somebody comes in and they have no ID at all, any ID, sorry, if they have other ID or sign the affidavit but have no proof of residency, if they can't show you that they live in your jurisdiction, then they're still registered to vote, but they are ineligible to vote in the upcoming election.
Say that one again, please.
So if they come with
No DL, right?
no current DL or PID, and they have no proof of residency, you still register them to vote, but they are not eligible in this election. The great thing about QVF now is QVF will have all these options for you. It'll be a drop-down, so when you register somebody in the 0 to 14-day period, you'll have to pick which one of these situations they fit in. QVF will then automatically mark it as challenged, voter as challenged, if that's the right place for them to be. Or they will just make them eligible for the following election, if that's the right place for them to be. So it's just extremely important that all of this is done in real time. These voters also need to get a receipt, especially those that might be going to the precinct on election day. They will all be given a receipt. Anybody who registered in this 0 to 14-day period. The receipt will say that they've been registered to vote, and they can show that to the precinct workers if something happens and somehow they don't end up in the e-poll book. Or even on election day, especially on election day, you give them a receipt and they can go to the precinct with their receipt. They will not be in the e-poll book, but they'll have a receipt that says that they get to vote. The other thing about this receipt is they either get a regular ballot or they get a ballot that has to be processed is challenged. The receipt will say that on it as well, so that the poll, if they go to the precinct, the poll worker will know to process the ballot as challenged. This is a discussion point I think we need to have, is when do we tell the voter that that's going to happen? When the clerk issues the receipt, if the receipt says challenged on it, the voter needs to know what that means. It's also important when the voter shows up to the precinct, if the precinct inspector starts writing on their ballot a number and covering it up, we want the voter to be informed before that happens. The discussions at the Bureau, we think the best person to do that is the clerk. We think that the best thing to happen maybe out of this committee is a script be given that we can share with clerks, so that the same information is being provided to every voter that comes in these 0 to 14 day period, so that clerks are prepared and they can have this discussion with the voter and everybody's giving the same message. If you happen to get a mail-in form in this 0 to 14 days, you will need to notice that voter that they are not eligible to vote in this election. Now, the law has changed a little bit here. The law now says that if you receive a mail-in ballot within 8 days before the election with no postmark, so you can't tell when it was mailed, if you receive it within 8 days before the election, more than 8 days or more before the election, and it's dated 15 days or more before the election, then you consider that mail-in application on time.
So in connection with both of those points, the people who are going to be registering by mail or applying for absentee ballots, sort of getting close up to the process, the question then becomes, I mean, we have this form, which is supposed to get to people. I mean, this is a draft, which is supposed to get to people to explain to them what they need to do and how they can vote in the upcoming election. But, you know, what is the best way, what else can we be doing to get this information, both to the clerks and to the voters, both in the really crush of time on election day itself, but also in that period of time when you may be getting something very close to the election. I mean, you get a voter registration form in the mail 3 days before the election. There's very little time to get back to that voter and give them that information so they understand. So, you know, what else can we think about to try to have an orderly, clear process that allows voters to get the information they need?
Drew, do you have a question or a comment?
Lori, I had a question on if they sign an affidavit, so they don't have proof, driver's license proof, but they've got that affidavit, are they eligible to vote in the election within the next 14 days or no?
If they sign the affidavit and have proof of residency, then they can vote.
But it'll be a challenge ballot?
Correct.
Okay, and then they receive notification that says in the following election, they're ineligible to vote in that election until they do the proper...
Nope.
No? Okay.
So that's another piece. When somebody is marked as challenged because they're in that 0 to 14 day period, they don't have a driver's license or a PID with their current address on it, and they've had to do one of these other methods. Even if they don't vote in the upcoming election, that challenge status is removed. Because they're no longer registering within the 0 to 14 days. They've actually registered well before the next election. And there's time to send them an ID card to see if it bounces back. The regular processes are then in place.
So what's that notification about in 1238? It says the notification of the individual, you kind of mentioned it, the individual will be given notifications they're not eligible to vote in the next election if they register through that whole list.
Right, so if they have other ID,
okay,
or no picture ID, and no proof of residency, everybody still has to meet the federal ID requirement. So even if they don't ever show an ID, as long as they put their social security number, the driver's license number on the application, or they have some sort of proof of their of that list, the utilities and those things, yeah. Then they can vote in the next election.
so what is the notification requirement under section 497, paragraph 6?
So I think it's a variation of this. Okay, this is the 0 to 14 day notice. If somebody has registered at a Secretary of State office or by mail, not at the clerk's office. So, you know, this is, I think, specific to a mail-in at a clerk's office, but it can be tweaked slightly for those other situations if they've if they've registered inside that 14-day period, not at a clerk's office.
Let me look
Does
at
that make
Form
sense?
97. Do you have a page number on the bill?
It's page 13, 497, paragraph 6, the new language at the bottom of it.
So that's if an individual, that
490
section there. Yep,
Or
is
493A.
Oh, 490, yep.
Yeah, 497, you're right.
So that is specific to somebody who goes to register at the Secretary of State's office in the 14 days before the election,
Okay.
not at the clerk's office.
Okay.
David?
So I have two quick questions. One, challenge ballots are provisional ballots, correct?
No.
No. What are challenge ballots for those of us that aren't?
So.
Well, that too, but challenge ballot in Michigan is a different thing that is not nearly as scary as it sounds, I think.
Correct. So a challenge ballot is, the ballot number is written on the ballot itself and covered up with a piece of paper.
Okay.
So when the stub comes off, if there is a lawsuit down the line, for some reason, a court challenge down the line, that particular ballot could be pulled out of the bucket.
They're still tabulated.
But they're still commingled with the,
Yes.
with the
Correct.
regular ballots, but they can be separated out, they can be identified and
But
separated.
it's tied to the voters.
In pencil.
It's if it's found that that voter was ineligible to vote.
So they
Now,
almost
look,
always
hold
get
on a
counted.
second, hold on a
Always.
second. I've been there since 1977. There've been a ton of challenge ballots. I've never seen a court case that has ever reached a point where the question came up, okay, we're gonna take that piece of paper off because this voter is not eligible. Because first of all, it has to make a difference in the outcome of the election, right? And then you're asserting that this person is not eligible to vote. It's never happened.
Really helpful.
And recent, I've called modern history.
Yeah.
And I think our legislature likes to throw this in sometimes.
It makes
They
everybody
themselves
feel
don't
good.
even realize what it means. They think it sounds like an extra.
So my second
know.
question is a quick point about something Jonathan raised, which is the notice requirement and getting notice out, which often you have to do very, very quickly because you've got a short window there. What percentage of records in the QVF have an email address and or a mobile number associated with them? And can you use them?
You can use them. That I can answer. I don't know the percentage. Small. We can ask.
That was gonna be my point,
Yeah.
is that if we could make this so that it was an automated process to email receipt if we have an email address. Because the reality is, voter registration drives turn voter registration forms into clerks all over. So I might get a voter registration drive that brings in 200 voter registration forms on the deadline, and they might be everywhere from Detroit to Kalamazoo registered voters. And by that time I sort and figure out exactly what jurisdiction, and then it gets to them, and then they have to send the mail. And sometimes, some jurisdictions don't do a great job of sorting them, so sometimes it's been to 2 or 3 other clerks before it gets to me.
So one last
tight
point I
timeline.
just make real quick, because I know we gotta get through the rest of the queue, is if we think it'd be helpful to be able to reach out to people electronically and to get more records associated with an email address and or a mobile number. I don't know if this is the case in Michigan, because it's not the case in almost every state, but we might wanna think about a way to legally protect that information from public disclosure, similar to like the driver's license number, which is also part of the voter record, but it's not part of the public file. Because I think that's a nice way to try to encourage voters to give you that information.
So, yeah, so on that point, just quickly, so there is a general exemption in public records laws in Michigan for personal information or privacy invasion. So, there is a general exemption under FOIA, Michigan FOIA, for privacy. And so, we're now on hold. For privacy, that we at the state level think applies to both email addresses and phone numbers. Apparently that was a really boring point I was making. So but of course, that's what we think, and then the reality is that these requests could come into 1,600 different election jurisdictions for this information. You could make a FOIA request to anybody. So part of that is sort of, how do we handle that? How do we administrate at the local level?
And I believe that might be a legislative change. We do have a section in the election law that exempts certain information.
If
I
so-
think the only way we're going to be able to protect it for sure would be to add this, add email to that list. Email on the voter registration app or in the QVF to that list. I think that's the safest course of action. Joe?
That was gonna be my comment, is that it's the only way it works is that this becomes automated and it's some type of electronic notification. Because in presidential years, I mean, the county we get copy paper boxes full of these things. Some of them come, some will come on the deadline, some will come right after the deadline, and they're gonna have to be treated differently and have to have notices go out. Postal buckets full of mail, some are on time, some aren't on time. There's no way logistically our office can sort through that many pieces to determine what's on time, what's not, get these out to local clerks, have them turn it around, start printing, stuffing, and mailing notices. If the QVF could default, if information is populated, do this. If information is not populated, like an email address or whatever, do this. And so it either goes to email or generates a hard copy for actual mailing in the US mail. But there's no way that we move as fast as we can, but I mean, just based on staffing and everything else, there's only so much we can push through in a day. And folks wait until the very last minute, sometimes after the last minute, to bring these things in.
But that would be 15 days, that would be the 15 to 30 day period?
This would
'Cause
be,
if-
or even inside the 15 days.
But 0 to 14, can you get a box of applications from a voter registration, or does the person have to register themselves?
I don't know that we could refuse the voter registrations. They would just not, in my opinion, they would not be eligible for this election because they're registering with us. So they would need to get that notice to say, hey, you've got to go do this again at your city or township.
Okay, so if you got a box of registrations on day 7, they would need to get that notice
That's
so that
right.
each individual person knew that they had a personal obligation to do
That's right.
something. Okay.
And I need like a day or two to sort them out and get them to the local clerk. So now if it was like at day 7, now we're at day 5. And now they've got it at day 5 and the clock is ticking. How quickly can they turn it around and sort them and get notices out? The voter gets it maybe at day 2, maybe at day 1. So electronic is so important if we have that data, if the QVF could just, automatically, if the data is there, generate it this way, if it's not, generate it that way.
So I have to tell you, in our LPI process that we went to, where we spent 4 days in a room together talking through these things, we started calling it Magic QVF. Because everything was, hey, we can just make QVF do that. Hey, we can just make QVF do that. So it's now Magic QVF. So here's one, we will tell Terry, here's one more thing for Magic QVF.
Yeah.
Because QVF will print out the receipt right now. It's programmed so that that receipt will print out automatically. But having it emailed automatically is even a better step.
Right.
All right, I think I jumped.
Nick, I think she was-
Okay.
What do we have? Who'd you have next?
I think Nick is next.
I just want to clarify a couple of things. Under the amendment, it says you have to go to the clerk's office, essentially. Shifting from the large jurisdictions, which have one set of problems, to the smallest jurisdictions, what do you do in those cases where the clerk doesn't maintain a regular office? I don't know if we still do, but we have, where they're basically operating under the home. How does that impact?
So he's talking about, we have many jurisdictions in Michigan that are very small. We have many of these clerks who operate out of their homes, who do their clerk jobs actually in off hours because they have other full-time jobs. I mean, we have some real challenges here, and what if they don't have regular office hours? That's the concern.
So now it says, okay, I have to go to the clerk's office, but there isn't a clerk's office in my jurisdiction because the clerk operates out of his or her home. Am I?
So I can tell you what we think, but I think this is a great point of discussion for the clerks here as well, because we don't have to do it, we just administer it. There are two important things that we think have to happen. The clerk has to have access to QVF, and the clerk has to have a printer in those last days. So our thought was, if that's at the clerk's home and they can do that and they have a secure way to get to QVF and can do it at home, and that's where voters know where to find them, we would think that that's the clerk's office, because the township hall might not even have internet. You know, it's possible that they couldn't do it at township hall or city hall.
Do they have to then start maintaining regular business hours out of their home?
I think that
Saturday
the
or
only
Sunday.
thing that's required are
Saturday
8
and Sunday have to
hours
do the 8 hours.
and all day on election day. They're also required to give notice 30 days before the election of when they will be available for this type of activity. And we're back to Magic QVF. We're talking about whether QVF can keep multiple addresses. Here's Township Hall. Here's where the clerk is going to be the Saturday and Sunday before the election. Here's where the clerk is going to be on election day. Those are sort of things that we were hoping, but that would require 1,600 clerks to fill all that information into QVF. Clerks are required to give us notice of where they're going to be available for voter registration the last 30 days and the Saturday and Sunday hours. To us, if you guys could just enter that into QVF, then you're only doing it once and you don't have to find some other way to notice, and I don't have to keep track of 1,600 emails. You know, so Magic QVF.
And I'm assuming that the term election official includes the deputies in the office? So that Janice doesn't have to be the one taking the registration in the city of Detroit. She can use her deputies in her office. But
That
they
would be
have
our
to be-
position.
But they have to be in the office. They can't do it at another site or somewhere else.
You could have another site.
The concept is that you also have that qualified voter file, and you're putting those voters right into the system, and it becomes
Right.
more critical on election day, so that, you know, people can see, you know, if someone tries to register in more than one place on election day.
And then what happens with the voter, the Secretary of State's office? If I'm registering in those 14 days, I've got to go back and re-register.
They're getting a notice.
But up to the 15 days, I'm registered. And then after that, if my driver's license, if my birthday falls, 15 days before an election, that's when I walk into the license.
The receipt would change,
Right now,
and it
what's
would have
that?
the instructions of what you need to do within 14 days, as opposed to what we told you on day 16.
Right.
So the receipt that the branch prints out.
Secretary of State's offices anyways, with the 30-day deadline. It usually
just
wasn't for
shifted
every
up to
election, but
15.
they were handing out at day 29 a notice before a statewide election saying, if you really want to vote in this next election, you have to go.
Right.
So Whitney and Kalila have, I think, comments on the registration piece, and then I think we should move on to.
Can I just,
Yeah.
just one last thing though, and we don't have to discuss it now, but I do want to preserve it for our discussion at some point, is what we do with college students. Because that was one of the things we lost in the qualified voter file. The initial legislation, it was subsequently changed by other legislation, and probably on the list of things for legislative action.
Jonathan, you wanted some offbeat ideas about how you address this. It seems to me that one of the things you could do is attack the question of why voter registration drives are sending paper these days. Pennsylvania, for example, has an API into their voter registration file. It's not open to everybody. There's a qualified process that takes 3 or 4 months to get approved, to have the right security clearance and so on to connect. But it means that when you look at the EVES data, they have one of the highest levels of third-party voter registrations and one of the easiest processes, because it simply goes into a queue. It gets checked at the Secretary of State's office and parceled out to the counties, just like any other voter registration, but it's not coming in as a big pile of paper. And that's the way that they've been, for instance, being able to start adding Section 7 agencies as those agencies get sufficiently computerized. I guess the other thing is, whenever I sit in a room and I'm listening to something that I just think, what is that? I sort of wonder, why does that have to exist anymore? Like, could I just put on the table that maybe the whole concept of challenge ballots needs to be revisited from the ground up? Because,
Yes.
right? I mean, the challenge ballots come from a day, I assume, largely before QVF, before electronics, and maybe it's time to revisit that as well. And I guess the third thing that I would say is about the very, very small jurisdictions. I know this is a problem. One of the things that California has in their law is that a election precinct that does not have sufficient voters, and I forget what the thresholds are, is designated to be all vote by mail, which solves the problem of having to hold a polling place open for under X number of voters, and I forget what X is, but it means that a county like Shasta County in way upstate California has some polling places in their big metropolitan areas. I use that term liberally, but the people who live up on the side of the mountain vote by mail. In fact, many of them come down and help be poll workers in the more metropolitan area as a way of participating. So I think there's some things you could do to address the very small, very large challenges that every state has, and in a way that would serve voters well, not force people to waste money holding a polling place open for 9 voters, and still have a really great election system.
Kalila?
Really a comment more on the administration side of the challenge ballots. The concern I have is in those areas where people will most likely not have a driver's license or photo ID, those are areas that tend to be more urban, and those are the areas that people come to challenge voters. And so my concern is really, how are you going to administrate the challenge ballots, especially if they're pre-challenged? You know, typically now, unless you know someone, you can't really challenge someone's registration, but this is certainly an avenue for certain groups to go forward and say, oh, these people registered using a utility bill or a driver's license that didn't have a current address. Let's just put them on a challenge list and then just show up at that precinct that day. So how is that anticipated to be administered? Because the challenge process is really what slows up the lines and creates the long lines in the first place.
So a couple of things. When you talk about the challenge process on election day, what we generally see, there are more challenges to procedures. Are procedures being followed? If people are coming to challenge the eligibility of voters that are there voting, they need to come with reason to believe they aren't eligible to vote. It's an issue of education, because these challenge ballots, that's why I say it's not really as it sounds. Our legislature puts for a couple of situations this language in. Those ballots of those voters are going through the tabulator unless, for whatever reason, pulled back by court order. It's not a challenger, but it's an educational piece, I agree.
I'm fully aware of how challenge ballots work. I work election day, I'm an election lawyer. My question is, having been challenged, not based on my registration, simply because I refused to show my photo ID because I purposely did not bring it into the precinct, I was challenged in West Bloomfield, which was incorrect. That aside, that was a process that was long, and clearly I'm someone that's informed about the election process. My question is, for someone who's showing with a utility bill, and they come in on election day, they think they're registered, they're already a challenge ballot based on 1238. So that means that the election person has to take their ballot, process it, and they're looking at everybody else go through without a problem. So how are there going to be changes to, one, inform them of the process, and two, should we be looking at challenging that provision? Because it really isn't, it's really there to slow down the process. And it's going to be used in those jurisdictions like Detroit and other jurisdictions to really target certain demographic of voters. So that's my concern, and so if we can think about that on the back end, that would be appreciated.
And I think it's already been raised as something to, I won't use that term again, challenge in the legislation. You know, I think that it's on that list because, you know, the way they have put that additional restriction.
It's a restriction.
And as you read the constitutional amendment,
We're going to move on to
So we have a couple more things we want to try to get through, make sure of course, we're identifying challenges, we're not going to solve everything today. We've already talked a little bit about the absent voter process and how Proposal 3 changes things, but I just want to sort of raise a couple other things up for people to think about and then interested in others' thoughts. But I mean, we have really through Proposal 3, I think we're sort of moving towards the notion that instead of having an absent voter ballot be like something you do if you can't vote on election day in person, that it's really an alternative to voting on election day. I think a lot of people have already been treating it that way in practice if they met one of the reasons, like being over 60, but now it's something that's really available to everybody. The other thing that it does is, in addition to sort of creating this alternative system of voting by mail, if that's what your choice is, it also expands what our version of, you might call early voting is. I know Chris doesn't love that term, but we've already had a system of early voting in a sense that you could come in and request an absent ballot and vote it there. And that, it won't be counted until election day, but you could vote the ballot earlier. That is being expanded through this process, both by making it no reason, but also by providing those weekend hours where clerks are available. So we're moving towards a system that in some ways resembles more what some states do via early voting. And so that both of those involve, I think some of the questions that raises for me is how do we need to start talking about this process differently? Do we need to change our emphasis of training for clerks and for election inspectors and others who might be dealing with this process, who may, get voters on election day at the polls who think they can use this process? And then, the other big one for me, I think, is, which I think Nancy already brought up, is the concern about volume. I mean, it's really how do we go about predicting what the volume is going to look like for our upcoming elections? I mean, May is one thing, but then of course 2020 is a whole other thing in terms of how are the civic groups, the political parties, and the other people who drive turnout and drive GOTV, how are they going to interface with this new absent voter system, and how is it going to influence the volume of ballots that we see when? And then I think one other point, and then I'm interested in others' thoughts, or if I missed something, would be, what do we need to look at in terms of the voters' ability to actually understand what's happening to their ballot and what they need to do to get it counted, and if it does count. I mean, we currently have 27%, I heard, people voting. That's going to go up. It could go up a lot. So what do we need to add on to that in terms of having better procedures for notifying voters if there was a problem with a signature or what have you? What tracking tools can we put in place so that voters have a better real-time ability to find out where their ballot is and if it's been accepted? And what training needs to go along with that? So those are the things, and you'll see that we just got passed around sort of an updated application. That was sort of the quickly implementing no reason, but I think we're looking at ways to further improve this and other communications to voters.
So Stephen, I think you're first.
Just a couple of points on absentee balloting in terms of volume. So two things on that. So for our county, we've been getting a lot of questions on this from our local clerks regarding what to expect in the coming elections, really with an eye towards 2020. And just looking at the last round of elections, specifically like the August 2018 election, where across the board, Michigan had high primary turnout in that election. Primary elections in 2018 also just nationally had high turnout. Among states that had similar voting laws as what we have now, absentee voting rates of 50-60% were not uncommon. So I think we need to be aware of a doubling of our absentee ballots is likely. The other point that I'd like to make on the volume, so volume leads to some problems for us counting ballots. And right now we have a narrow window to count absentee ballots, 7 a.m. on election day to 8 p.m. And if it goes later, it goes later, but we can't start until 7 a.m. And in order for us to get through all of the ballots with our current equipment setup, we would need more time. Or we would need a lot more equipment to count a lot larger volume in the same narrow window. But if we do that, we right now have the ability to spoil an absentee ballot in Michigan. This is a very unusual practice and something I think we need to look at. When is an appropriate cutoff for spoiling an absentee ballot? Right now, anybody, if your ballot hasn't been sent to the absentee counting board, you can spoil your absentee ballot. And we're going to see that in a major way in the presidential primary in March.
All right, Joe?
Couple comments. One is, with this perceived increase in absentee voting, years ago we talked about a way for these folks to be able to take their ballot and put it through a tabulator without having it actually counted to have the tabulator look at their ballot to make sure that there was not any issue with it. Because what we know is our open primary causes a lot of problems with cross parties. We can address that in the precinct because the tabulator lets the voter know they cross parties and they can get an opportunity for a second ballot. But with absentee voters, they don't have that luxury, and we end up tossing out thousands and thousands of ballots every primary. And you know, the outcomes in some races could have been different had these voters had an opportunity to correct it. So is there a mechanism that we could put in place? And this new voting equipment certainly is a lot more technologically advanced than the previous iteration that we had, and that you can make it so that it cannot have the polls closed and you cannot generate results on it. You know, could you set up a tabulator so a voter could go into a clerk's office, put it through, know that there's no issue with it, fold it up, put it in the envelope, and then turn it in? That's one comment. Second comment is, you know, a lot of other states, and it's difficult here because we're so decentralized, but maybe this could be done at the state level. A lot of other states are a lot more progressive on this than we are, where counties, when they're sending out absentee ballots, they're barcoding these ballots, and it's in the software that when it's mailed out, the barcode is scanned, the voter gets a text message, the ballot's on your way to your house. Then when the voter, you know, gets their ballot and mails it back, you know, the barcode is scanned by the post office, the voter gets a notification, your ballot's in the postal service. Your ballot's now been returned to the clerk's office. Once the clerk's office has checked the signature on it and verified that the envelope's okay, they get a final text message that says your ballot has been received and will be sent for processing. So that voter has been able to, through text message, track their ballot through every step of the process, up to and including getting a text message telling them that their ballot was received and okayed by the clerk's office. So they know that. So I think that's something that, because we're so decentralized, it would never work on a local level, like to have everybody do it. But if it was a way to do it through the state system somehow, through the magic QBF, that's a thought, right? So allow better tracking of those ballots. Right now, it requires the voter to actually initiate the tracking by going to the website, putting in information. But what if it was all done like they're doing in other states, where the counties are able to barcode these envelopes and it goes out and it's done that way? So we can think about that. And I am convinced, like in our county, our average absentee rate is between 30 and 33%, depending on the election. It sort of varies. We know that the interest groups and the civic groups, they mail out AV applications just like our local clerks do. And I think there's been a big hesitation in the past from voters who get this app from a political party or from a civic group, and they look at it and they say, boy, this looks real convenient, but none of these reasons really apply to me, right? So they never fill it out. Well, now the app's gotten really, really simple. All they gotta do is just sign it and send it back. So I think we will see folks opt for the convenience, and we could certainly see that 30 to 33% in our county look more like a 40%, you know, or even higher. So, you know, how do we adjust for that? We've encouraged our local clerks to purchase additional equipment, you know, for their absentee counting board, for the sort of, you know, for the processing and the counting side of it, is sort of the election day and post-election day side. But really, some of this other stuff is like pre-election stuff, and how can we better serve the voter on the front end of the experience, and then, you know, we can talk about the back end of the experience and getting results out, you know, later. But those are my comments.
If someone on the phone has us on hold or is not paying attention, please take us off. We have Amber in the queue, but we can't really get to her with this music. So, who's the next in person?
Matt.
They can't hear me at all.
Well, I mean, if they have us on hold, unfortunately, they can't hear your message.
I'm working on getting the person off of hold, but in the meantime, I think, Matt, you had something to say?
Yeah. One flag is I would just add this, like a checkbox to the standard voter registration form to be able to opt into absentee ballot request. It makes it far easier to handle it as long as it's an easy data entry process into QVF, into the magic QVF. It can become much easier for both handling of forms by third-party organizations and reduce the amount of paper flying around inside a clerk's office, in my experience in Montana.
Can I just also, like as AVR, just include that as part of the
So
provisions?
that's something that I'm less sure of, because what we find in AVR procedures is the more questions we ask, the less automatic it is, the higher the decline rate, the less that we've actually automated the voter registration process, and we're pushing people into other processes.
But it could go in the follow-up card, right?
Yeah.
If you're sending a voter notification card, you can also do a follow-up card that says you can go online and change this.
The second thing, this piece here of city, township, jurisdiction, precinct terrifies me. Having done a lot of voter registration in the field, the number of times that I saw people put that their county was USA makes me think that both a city and a township, like people are going to get that wrong. A lot of people will just leave it blank, which is probably fine, but a lot of people are going to get it wrong. I'm curious, the permanent list, there's a lot of places that refer to things as permanent, and really what they are is you get on the list for a couple of elections and then you're gonna get something in the mail, and I there's something about language and making sure that people know that this is a, yeah, and like figure out, I used to call our list in Montana the perpetual opt-in list, because you're gonna get asked every 2 years if you wanted to in fact opt in to the permanent list again, and it was confusing for voters who every 2 years were really frustrated that they had been dropped off the list because they missed the postcard because they had been told that it was permanent. And then the other thing I wanted to say on open primary, I think, so Colorado now has an open primary for unaffiliated voters. If you're a registered Republican or Democrat, you can't cross over and vote the other ballot, but unaffiliated voters get 2 ballots in the mail. Same thing in my home state. Everyone is, there's no party registration in Montana, but we don't put all candidates on one ballot together. We get 2 different pieces of paper, and you pick one to fill out and you leave one blank. In Colorado, you just throw the blank ballot away, which was new to me coming from Montana, where you still mail both of them back and you put one in the I voted this envelope and you put the other one in the I didn't vote this envelope. But I think the error rates are lower, and I think it might be worth exploring some of those options. That's a little outside the scope of this conversation, but I know it's been an issue here, so wanted to flag that.
May I jump in first? Our absent, for the out of town folks, out of state folks, our absent voter ballot application, our law says that you can request an AV application by written request signed by the voter, and it used to say and give us the reason. Now we don't have to do that. Or on an application provided by the clerk, and then it spells out the application. But what it says is, the application has to be in substantially the following form. So I think we have to have some discussion as to what's substantial compliance when it comes to this form. Because all of these elements,
Right. Well,
we have added elements, but we haven't taken anything out from what's in the
You want
law.
them somewhere, but you could have them in a place that doesn't suggest that the voter has to know them, that someone else
Yes.
will fill that in based on their address.
All right, folks on the phone, if one of you who recently put us on hold has rejoined, just a note that if you put us on hold, then all we hear is music. So if you could just hang up and then join back on, that would be great. And we have Amber next in line.
Oh, this is great, and yeah, I agree on the whole thing. That's like that's crazy. It's like it's not only whole, but it's all of you guys talking as well. It's like it's intense. Well, I want to say a couple of things, I guess, because there's been a lot of talk of Colorado. So I guess I would like to throw out, and this might be an idea for a future meeting. I am happy to walk through the evolution of kind of how this all works in Colorado, because I was the one running the process in Denver, and I'm also the one that architected the Colorado voting model as it stands today. And part of the reason that we made certain decisions in the legislation and all of that process was because of a lot of the challenges that we are talking through today in terms of how the laws are currently structured in Michigan. So one thing, in my experience here, and as I approached our writing of our laws,
I basically said, look, if it's not needed anymore and there's no purpose and it's not helping voters and it's not helping election administrators, there is no reason to keep it. And we ended up striking a lot of outdated things in the law, which ultimately streamlined the process for voters, and it reduced the administrative and operational inefficiencies for administrators. So I agree with everybody who's kind of touched on this whole sentiment of, you know, it's just because it's been there for 30, 50, 100 years, whatever it is, doesn't mean that it needs to stay there. And I really do think we should contemplate identifying things that will make everybody's lives easier. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody across the board. Second thing, on the permanent kind of mail-in ballot piece, a lot of states, and you know, now that I'm running this national group, our experience in Colorado has mirrored what a lot of states are going through, in that when you have a no excuse process like what Michigan has now passed with Measure 3, and you know, kind of, you know, provide for voters to request that each time, basically you're just creating administrative burdens on election officials to process those requests every time. So when you say permanent, it really and we ended up changing our language on our mail ballot application to say, I want to receive my ballot for every election at home. And that was more clear to voters than saying absentee or mailing my ballot or anything like that. It really just opted them in. They could declaratively state in a sentence, I want to receive my ballot for every election going forward at home. And then if they opt out at some point, that's great. Or if they move, we would take them off of that list if we receive notification that they moved. But if they moved and told us, that would transfer with them. So I guess the reason for saying some of that is I am happy to provide a briefing, kind of just to walk through some of the mechanical things around all of this. We experienced a lot of heartburn sort of in transition over about a decade, and it would be great if maybe some of that experience would hopefully prevent Michigan from having to go through some of the same heartburn. So thanks.
Thanks, Amber. Nancy, I know you're
Yes, everybody's been talking about absentee voter ballot applications, and one thing that I do want to raise with you, because I've not heard the issue of write-ins. And we were faced last August with a situation where one political party had no candidate on the ballot for the primary election, and the other party did. And I was shocked at the number of registered voters who had already been issued absentee ballot applications, who went into their clerks and asked that they cancel them out and let them have new ballots so that they could do a write-in. And I never would have believed that that write-in person could win. The person did win and did go on in terms of, so I think that while we tend to be talking about AV ballots being just AV ballots, be aware of the political sophistication of some of these elections, that we were blindsided when suddenly here come all these people who wanted to cancel and did in fact, the clerks were not happy, but did in fact have to cancel them well before the election.
Thanks. Chris?
Okay, I have a couple things, actually a few things related to absentee ballots that I think are important. One, Whitney kind of hit on it earlier, was the ability to return the ballot to the polling place. You know, several years ago our law was changed, and now the ballot has to be exactly the same between what's mailed out and what's used in the precinct on election day. And there's no longer any reason that the voter should not be able to just return their ballot, record it in the QVF that they returned it. Right now the voter has to spoil that ballot and get a new ballot and mark it, and half the time they've already marked the other ballot, and so they want to take that ballot that they marked with them so that they can remember who they voted for, and then that, you know, becomes a monitoring situation for our election workers. There's no reason that that ballot shouldn't be able to be returned at the polling place, although that is a law change.
You mean returned or returned and counted there?
Returned and counted, yes, yeah. I would love to be able to send an absentee ballot application to every voter. There was the court case, I believe, involving Detroit years ago that doesn't enable us to do that, but I wonder, I know that there's nothing specific in the constitutional amendment that changes that, but I wonder if there's enough of a nose under, camel's nose under the tent, that we could get that changed. Without requiring a change in law, though, I'm not sure how many of these have been printed yet. I love that the sign-up is on the AV application. I think it should be on the voter registration form, too. The sign-up to be on the permanent automatic list. I would love to be able to use one application for an entire calendar year, rather than, we have 3 elections this year, and I'm going to be, we are allowed to use, if we have a primary in general, we're allowed to do one application for both, but so I'll be mailing 2 applications for 3 elections this year. I love the idea of being able to count ballots that are returned with a postmark on election day, as long as they're received within a couple of days. That would be a big change for how we process in Michigan. And then the final thing is, it's already kind of been touched on, the ability to either count earlier or later. As part of getting ready for our risk limiting audit, we visited Denver, and I was kind of shocked when their election director said, at 10 o'clock on election night, we just stopped, because that's when mistakes happen. And having a couple weeks earlier been up until 3 in the morning and saw mistakes happen, that, I think we have to change it in one direction or the other. We have to be able to process earlier, or we have to get rid of the expectation that we're going to be done before the 11 o'clock news, because it's just not realistic.
Thanks. Nick?
Yeah, on the absentee ballot counting, the reasons I think that you had to wait till election day to count, one of them is very archaic. I mean, it's the old system before we started voting on the optical scanning type equipment, where we had paper ballots that were mailed in, and they literally had to count it, and you had to sequester the counting board because you couldn't have information going in and out prior to the election. With the optic scanner, that's not a problem, right? You just feed it in. As long as that thing stays sealed and locked away, you should be able to do it prior to election day without a real problem. But there is a real problem that we have to be cognizant of, and I'm not sure how we would deal with it. Nancy mentioned it, where there was a change. We had a situation in my hometown where the candidate, the incumbent for county commissioner, died, and the party named a new nominee, and we literally went back to all the people who had voted absentee, asked them to go back, because his name, even though we nominated his wife, his name, votes for him wouldn't count for her, so they had to go back, and most of them did go back and change them. Now, if you'd already fed it into the machine, that would be problematic. I don't know how you address that. Fortunately, that's kind of rare. The one that's less rare are people who, for other reasons, have decided they want to change who they're voting for. I'm less concerned about that, but I do think we'd have to have some mechanism to try to figure out what do we do if a person died, and then we've already fed it into the machine. Other than that, it seems to me that the other advantage to feeding it into the machine, particularly for people like me who vote absentee by going into the clerk's office, filling in the application, filling in the ballot, and voting right then and there, is that if I fed it into the machine, it would give it back to me if I had overvoted or made some other error. Now you're stuck with, by vote, you can't help those people who made a mistake in the ballot on election day or even before. And if there was some mechanism to deal with that, that would be great. I don't know if that's solvable. That's a more difficult problem to solve. But one of the great things when we moved from punch card ballots, which my city had wanted me to go to punch card ballots from machine ballots, and I fought them because of the fact that Clinton Township, just north of me, had kept track of how many spoiled ballots there were the year before, and it was like 30% of the people that voted in a primary election. The app scanners solved that, but it doesn't solve it with the AVs, and I don't know if there's some way we can address that somewhere along the line. The last problem with the AVs, I think, is the legislation that was passed before. I don't think the constitutional amendment dealt with it, which limits the ability to send out, and Chris was talking about, you can only send out an application, you can't have a permanent list of people who want to vote AV and so forth and so on. And that's something I think we should try to find a legislative fix to, that if you got somebody who's always going to vote at home, knows they want to always vote at home, now you can do it for any reason, for, you these keep lists of people who are over 60 and those sorts of things, and automatically send them. Now you can only send them the application. For a while, I think they had a statutory provision that said you could only send them an application to get an application, a ballot, and that went away. But to try to be able to have those permanent lists again would be really, really, I think, beneficial to the clerks and to the people who are casting those ballots.
Yeah, sure. And then I think we're gonna have Whitney and Mary had her hand up, and then I think we're gonna try to move on to AVR, because we're getting short on time.
So maybe not for a point of discussion right now, but I would be interested in knowing what clerk's thoughts are on how early is too early to start processing, because really you have so many things you need to do up until Election Day. I mean, you have other things that you need to be doing. When could you process AV ballots, or when could you have precinct inspectors come in and process AV ballots? And what is the cutoff when it's too late, when people want to, does the spoiled ballot need to move back? What is a time frame that you guys think would work?
I mean, realistically, to be totally honest with you, having Monday and Tuesday as processing days is enough time. I mean, if you worked all day Monday, your AV board, and then worked on Election Day, there'd be no reason that they should not be done. And I think the way that you handle it is, once the ballot is sent for processing, it's no longer able to be spoiled. And that's it.
Okay.
And if we're talking about Monday, anybody who passes away and now there's a write-in candidate, likely that's in advance of that, so people would have plenty of time to spoil. I think, and that, I think, puts the legislature's fears at ease if we're only talking about one additional day of processing. And the new voting equipment has security features where it cannot be closed out until a date and time certain, unlike the old equipment where it could be opened, generate the results, close, reopen. Can't do that with this equipment. So you can actually set it up so you cannot get results until a date and time certain. So I think even in my largest community, 2 days of processing is more than adequate.
Thank you.
So I hope this doesn't make your head spin, but I think we need to, if we're going to see a move to more voting from home, one of the things you're going to have to consider is how you make voting from home accessible. Other states have handled this. Oregon, for 9-10 years now, has been doing what they call the alternative ballot, which is an electronic ballot that can be downloaded. The voter can download it. They use their home computer to mark their ballot, and they print out a ballot to be mailed back. So this is not internet voting. This is not voting over the internet. New Mexico just won a clery for their version of that. Ohio, California requires it and has been certifying remote accessible vote by mail systems. I think one of the things you're going to have to think about is who is allowed to use them. There might be an advantage to everyone being allowed to use them, because you get the advantage of the scanner, because you've got overvote prevention. So that someone who's voting from home has an opportunity to vote in a way that gives them the same overvote protection it gives them in the county office. You also get all the accessibility features of your own equipment, so you can. It both helps people with extreme disabilities who use very specialized assistive technology, but it also helps people who just need the text a little bigger, like so many of us. And I think you need to have those rules thought through. I think there's all kinds of reasons why making that as wide as possible is a great idea. But one of the things that means is you're gonna have to think about what the format of the ballot that comes back from the mayor. It may not be exact, so you may have either to be able to read that ballot so that you can read, say, a list summary ballot as well as an optical scan ballot. So there's some equipment issues there. And I guess the one other thing I want to throw in is although you've just said you think that 2 days would give you enough time, I sat here thinking, why couldn't there be a sort of like the consolidated grain threshers, right, where you bring your grain in to be ground at one mill, not at every single little mill? Why couldn't there be a county-wide high-speed scanner? Because they can manage multiple ballots, multiple jurisdictions, and jurisdictions could bring their ballots in to be scanned if they wanted to. I mean, so there's some things you could do with technology that would make it possible for even your very small townships to have access to more modern and high-speed equipment than they would normally be able to afford.
Thanks, Wendy. We are looking at some of those technologies, but it's a really good reminder to keep in mind accessibility, also language access, as we're going through all of these things, that we make sure that we think about how all these changes are going to affect the entire community.
Sorry, since you said language access,
yeah.
oh, sorry,
I shouldn't-
Secretary Benson, you have precedence over me.
I actually had a question about just the Monday before Election Day being sufficient for counting the ballots. Does that take into consideration the great significant increase of ballots that we can anticipate? And is there any reason to not allow localities to start counting on Friday before an election? Is there other than the security component, which we could kind of think through, you can have the option maybe of starting even earlier, like on Friday, especially.
Talking with Clerk Winfrey, even maybe looking at a population threshold of like the largest communities, larger communities could start earlier because of, volume. So, but I think the only way to really sell it to the legislature is to somehow keep it narrow, but allow exemptions for the largest places in the state.
Mary, did you have?
Just to piggyback on that, I was thinking, when the question was initially asked, I thought a week. But then if we did Friday and we worked Saturday and Sunday, and Monday and Tuesday, then certainly we can count 100,000 ballots. I think that's a great help and get election results out by the 10 o'clock news.
I just want to throw on the table to keep in mind when we're talking about how we restrict when you can spoil your ballot as an AV. I think most clerks, at least my worst nightmare for spoiling AVs is attached to the presidential primary, where in 2016, we had a cast of thousands on the Republican ticket, and as they would drop off the face of the earth, I would have voters come back in. I want to spoil my ballot, my candidate's out of the running. And I had one gentleman who voted 6 times. I wanted to say to him, just vote Democratic and you'll be okay. I couldn't do that, and so that kind of thing, just keep that on the radar screen. There are certain elections that evoke more spoils.
Okay, we're gonna move to ABR now, because we're into our last half hour, and we'd like to make sure there's enough time to cover this.
So Chris pointed us to the word automatically. We've had some discussion about that. I think, the opt-out is really the sense of it. It's that when someone comes in to our Secretary of State branch office, which is what we call the DMV here for our out-of-state folks, it's that transaction is registering them to vote unless they do something affirmative to not be registered. So it's not just streamlining it, it's really when you've registered to, or when you've signed up for your driver's license or your ID card or renewed it, unless you tell us something affirmatively, that is a voter registration for you as long as you're eligible. So the task before us is converting all of those branch transactions, whether they be in-person transactions, mail transactions, online transactions, into something that is a voter registration, unless somebody does something to make it not so. And so this is a little different, I think, from some of our other challenges, because at least at the interaction with the voter level, it's really happening with non-election employees. It's happening with our staff that administers our driver's services. So, but, of course, the way that comes to the way those people actually get on the voter file then does come back through election officials, sometimes the Bureau of Elections, sometimes the local clerks, sometimes a combination. So as we're going through this, we have a variety of different types of transactions. What you have before you is probably like the most straightforward changeover from my standpoint, and what you're looking at is basically our enhanced driver's license application, the current version. You have to be a citizen to get that kind of driver's license, so it makes it kind of the most straightforward in terms of eligibility. And that comes with what we call our blue and white, which unfortunately is black and white for you, but you know, taxpayer money. But that is something that basically the way the transaction works right now when you get your enhanced driver's license is or any other driver's license is you have this separate form that is not duplicative but does require you to basically fill out a registration portion. We're trying to incorporate all of that into the enhanced driver's license application so that you are providing the information you need to be registered, and then you have the opportunity to opt out. Then we're going to look at, and again, this is an initial mock-up, it's not the final product. We've gone through a few versions of this. It's going to be something that instead of giving you an extra registration form, gives you some kind of receipt that lets you know that you're getting registered, that lets you know what's going to happen next. The biggest challenges, I think, that I've looked at, although I really want to know what other people think about this, is, you know, by making registration an opt-out, you know, how are you putting people who would otherwise basically be on notice because they're filling out a registration form, putting them on notice to know the things that they need to know, like just in case some mistake's been made, if they're not eligible, what they need to do to not get registered. If they have concerns about their address being public, what they need to know about that. We have a method through our current blue and white where we collect the voters' previous jurisdiction for where they were registered. And so, you know, when you make it an opt-out form, you could theoretically make everyone write out their old address as part of the driver's license process, but as to Matt's earlier point, that's really adding a lot to the application. So how do we collect that information, if at all? And again, underlying all this is we do not want to slow down the process for people to get their driver's licenses when they're in the branches. The other thing that's also been mentioned is we often don't get an interaction with somebody as they're 18 or they're about to be 18 through the driver's license process. You have a lot of people who have their first interaction at 15 or 16, and then they don't often actually have to come back in or interact with the branch office until they're 21, because they get a new license when they're 18, but it just gets mailed to them. So we're really missing these prime years, probably the most important years for a driver's license-based registration process when you don't get those 18 to 21-year-olds. So how do we reach that population? That's a challenge. And then the other one that's been on my mind a lot is we have, you know, this transaction that I've given you is probably the most straightforward because it's in person and it's a citizenship question already. But we have a lot of other interactions where we're not always asking for citizenship, and we aren't always collecting all the information we need to determine eligibility as part of the underlying transaction. And so how can we modify the process to make sure that we're only registering eligible people, but we're not collecting extraneous information that we otherwise wouldn't need, and that we're not, you know, moving away from the idea of automatic as an opt-out. So there's many more things. We're already behind, but those are some of the things we're trying to look at. And then I guess underlying all that, what does it look like when it gets to the Bureau of Elections, or what does it look like when it gets to the local clerks? Because now we're not going to have these more traditional looking voter registration forms.
Should we go to David first? We'll just go around the room this direction.
A couple quick things. So just so I understand, the automatic part of this would be applying only to those who are applying for an enhanced license, so documented citizenship.
Just the form you're looking at.
Okay.
So we have many different types of transactions. This is probably the most straightforward. So
Okay.
I think it's useful for a discussion draft because to get one of those driver's licenses, you have to be a citizen.
So and I'm happy to put the pin in there, other options.
Yeah.
Also, if I understand it from talking to Chris many times about this over the years, Michigan is particularly advanced in terms of updating existing registrations with new DMV information. If there's because this is a big issue in other states with AVR, because a licensing transaction that changes an address, for instance, on an existing registration, that data is often not getting into the voter file. Michigan, as I understand it, is particularly advanced in doing that very well. as you join Eric, we'll find out if that's actually true. I think that's, I suspect it is true, but you probably find there's more cases that fall through the cracks than you expect. And then the last point, which is the 18 to 20-year-olds, since I just brought up Eric, one of the things that I've wanted to see states who are in ERIC do more is, for those that don't know, ERIC will give you the names, information on everyone in the DMV file who doesn't have a matching voter file for outreach. And you will know whether they just turned 18, for instance. And one of the things we do know from a lot of research is that outreach to people just as they're turning 18 gets higher rates of return than just general outreach that's more tied to the election calendar. Always better to tie registration to life events rather than the election calendar, because that helps you all, because those are spaced out over the time rather than just right before an election. So it might be that ERIC is one way to, it doesn't directly relate to Proposal 3, but to fill in the gaps on the 18 to 20-year-olds with targeted outreach that specifically addresses the life event that just occurred to them.
Great. Matt?
So I think David's saying something very smart, as he usually does, but the thing I would say, like, this language in here looks to me like it's very, very much written to ensure that this application complies with the NVRA. My understanding, again, not a lawyer, the NVRA applies to transactions involving eligible individuals. Someone who's 16 or 17 is not an eligible individual, therefore the NVRA does not apply. And when they shift in eligibility but do not have another transaction, I think that the state of Michigan can treat them in a different way under the state constitution that says that they can be automatically registered to vote as a result of conducting business. So I don't know why that outreach couldn't be an opt-out rather than an opt-in under the Michigan Constitution.
Joe?
And if like the mailer bounces or whatever, I would not treat that as a failure to decline. I would treat that as you don't register someone if the mail bounces back. But I would say that if it bounces back, the decline, keep them off, but otherwise put them on the voter rolls.
And I'll just say briefly, I totally agree that that's a possible way of handling it. Nothing in the ERIC membership agreement would prevent you from doing that. I think it's mostly an administrative issue of how you make sure they get registered in the right way with all the information that you need.
I just think logistically too, we need to make sure we have a good handle on this, because in the past, we did get folks from branch office transactions on the rolls who were not citizens, and then it was, a burden on local election officials to then take them out of the system or challenge their status if they did not respond. It got some of these folks crossways with their future citizenship aspirations, et cetera. So how are these going to be handled with this automatic registration, where individual completes this but marks, they're not a citizen, so they're not eligible to be a registered voter? Are they never going to populate into the qualified voter file then? I mean, I know the systems are mirror images, and this was sort of an issue in the past, but we really do not want those folks in the system if they are not eligible based on the completion of this form. We don't want them to be moved over to the system and then have us be the ones to have to take them out.
So that's a really good point, and that's something that we need to look at from a programming perspective in terms of both how the branch staff and the election staff sees or is able to interface with that. I mean, there should be a way to determine if they've indicated no on the citizenship
And
question.
there is a checkbox now on that branch system. It has not been there for a super long time, but probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And so I'm interested, first, Joe, have you seen a decline in those problems as far as you know?
I think it's been on the decline.
Because there's a checkbox, and there's also, there's been a really renewed emphasis on their procedures, because, as you're coming in for a driver's license and that documentation, and they are pretty well-trained to recognize documentation that indicates non-citizenship. So there's a couple of things there.
And that's my point, I think, is that as this all becomes a new thing in the branch, that these folks are up to speed and aware of, when to check that box, when not to check that box, so folks either get over or don't get over, and we don't run into what we had in the past.
So I want to come back to your question about language access. Sorry, I don't remember what determinations you have in Michigan, but I know that you have many language communities here. And one of the recent pieces of data that we heard was a state that was the DMV was giving every customer a voter registration form, even if they had said they weren't a citizen. That's been corrected. But one of the things that they found out, that they noticed, was that the people who were making the most mistakes were from more recent immigrant arrival groups who were not covered by Voter Rights Act language access, but were had a less strong community to rely on to know the difference. And so some of the African languages, Arabic, for instance, or Farsi, were making actually more mistakes in their opting in or opting out of voter registration. So this sort of argues to me for more translated materials, I'm sorry to say, or at least more translated notices or clearer instructions for interpreters, but in general being sure that the voter registration material at least is translated.
Sharon?
So, okay, I have 3 questions. Number 1, I happen to work in an organization that also has an immigrant rights team, and I happen to share an office with her. So we've talked about this, and I want to go back to what I said around Proposal 3, and I'm curious why this is not as simple as I thought it was. You know, when I talked to the immigrant rights team, my understanding is that there's a list of documents that you must provide when you come in to get a driver's license or a personal ID, and those documents will determine whether you fit into the citizens category or all other. And so I'm just kind of curious, the way I explained it was that, you know, the discretion wouldn't necessarily be up to branch staff to have to determine it, that there would be, I was envisioning like a checkbox, and you'd check whichever thing on that list was the form that they were giving you, and then that would drive you to the next transaction. So that's my first question. Do you want to answer that, and then I do the other 2, or?
Do you want to go?
Well, you have the enhanced version in front of you,
Okay.
first of all. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, the other version for non-enhanced driver's license may have more check boxes right on that form as to what type of documents you're bringing in.
Yeah, and I mean, there's ways to, so I think to your point, Sharon, if it's designed properly and implemented properly, that, you're right, it should be pretty straightforward. But, you know, the thing that I'm worrying about, and that I think the thing that we need to make sure we get right is making sure that design and that system is actually translating to use at the branch offices that does not result in someone checking the wrong box. I mean, because if there's the potential for the branch staff to, you know, override something or hit the wrong button, notwithstanding what the form says, that's where I think it comes back to some of the other things we've been talking about with implementing other things about education, training, and just sort of putting everyone on notice. But yes, I mean, if it's designed properly, we shouldn't have that problem. But I'm thinking about it in terms of redundancies and security.
John,
Okay.
can I say something on that real quick?
Yeah.
So in other states, and I think this is true in Michigan too, there's basically 3 broad groups of 3 buckets someone can fall in. 1, they've shown documenting proof of citizenship, because that's one of the things they could show. No question, they should be offered the opportunity, they get automatically registered. 2, they've shown documenting proof of non-citizenship, because you can usually, you have a green card, you can get a license, that's totally legal. But they should not be in the lane to get offered a chance to register. You shouldn't trick them into maybe getting registered. And then almost every state I've seen, with few exceptions, has a 3rd bucket, which is they've shown one of the forms of identification that does not indicate whether they're a citizen or not. And I don't know if that's true in Michigan, but I'm guessing you have maybe a few forms that might fit into that category. If you don't, no problem. But those people should be offered a chance to register, but you also have to make sure the language is very clear to them that that's only eligible for citizens. And to your point, you're exactly right. You want this to be baked into the system so much there's not much discretion.
And one example of that is, like, for example, if you've had a, oh yeah.
Well,
theoretically there are 3 buckets. I want to hear from the
but I
staff.
can't speak specifically to how it all works in the Secretary of State DMV end. I used to know a lot more about that when I worked on that end, but I think David is right. I mean, there are, you know, there's lists and lists of documents that you can bring in, and then it depends on that combination as to A, whether you can get a driver's license, and now B, whether you can register to vote. And aside from all that, there is also a checkbox on their driver's license processing screen that goes yes, no, citizenship after all is said and done.
I think the issue, as I've heard from our branch experts, I guess you could call them, is that there is a portion of the population in Michigan that didn't have to show citizenship documents before obtaining. And so it's not the new transactions, it's more the renewals. It's more the people who are coming in with a driver's license that they got and didn't have to show. I mean, probably mostly Canadians, right? Who like who've been here for a long time and just been renewing their driver's license. So I think we don't know. My understanding is that we don't know exactly how big that population is or how we would identify them necessarily.
That was an excellent clarification, Sal.
And I want to jump in and say that that is exactly what I have heard as well from the branch.
But where they want to get eventually is to automate it so that when those documents are shown, there's no ability to do a voter registration.
I will also say this, not to get too far on the branch end, but they are getting to full implementation of this Real ID program too, which in the end, I believe is supposed to get everybody, even who's been licensed forever and ever, to come back and reestablish. So, and that's not too far away, next year, I think.
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
So the other two questions I had is, I'm just curious why you've said if you do not meet the voter registration requirements listed below, you must decline, because I don't know that no matter how many times you tell people that, it actually changes. And I worry that that somehow undermines the very important language that we put in there that said that if you get registered without your, without your intending to be, that you're not at fault, the default, whatever it's called, the fail-safe language, right? I'm a little bit worried that the more we pile on with like, you must not register, that you might be undermining that a little bit. But there are probably lots of AVR experts in here who know otherwise. And then
We agree with you.
Oh, okay, good. and then the important notice about the voter registration information, I think that's hurting you really a lot. Unless we're legally required to tell them that at this time, I think that's going to undermine I think that's going to cause a lot more people to not register.
And I wonder if what you're really trying to say is that if you're in a group of people whose address is protected, don't do this now, which is a different issue.
I think that's handled differently.
No, I mean, we don't have an address compact yet.
You don't have,
So that's one of the concerns
there
here.
you go.
Is if you have somebody who doesn't want their address public, how do you notify that person? I mean, because this is the chance. So that's
Well,
what
I'd be
that's
happy to
getting at.
talk about that and bring in more like Michigan experts than me on this issue, but I do think that this notice is going to cause people to not register. So even though it's true.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, this is a discussion draft, so really
So that's why-
open
so
to
that's my
suggestions of
feedback.
language from everyone. Okay. Chris, yeah.
Okay, on the opt-out, a couple of issues. One, from what we see in reality, sometimes, the way it's phrased, I decline to register to vote. Sometimes people think, oh, I'm already registered, I don't need to do that. So they're gonna decline because they know they aren't supposed to register twice. Sometimes when people would check a box like that, they would mean, I want my voter registration to stay at my parents' house instead of matching my driver's license, which isn't allowed under Michigan law. And sometimes they mean, I'm not registered and I don't want to be registered. And sometimes they mean, I'm currently registered and I want to unregister. So if somebody checks that box, you're not going to know what they mean. It's a little bit too fuzzy because it could have many meanings, and the voters see it in very different ways.
So one thing we talked about in an earlier meeting was, so this is registration. There's no way now through the branch office system that you can cancel your registration. It doesn't happen. There's no way to do that. So likewise, I don't think AVR can be a cancellation process. So in other words, really AVR for changes of address should only apply to people who are not registered. And if you're already, because you're not going to give a form, I mean, you shouldn't be giving a form to every person walking through the door. We don't do that now. So, it will not have the effect of canceling anybody's registration.
But they'll believe it does, and they'll be mad at me because.
Well, and keep this in mind, this is the driver's license application.
Right, yeah,
Right?
I understand that, but that's, yeah, I opted out as the Secretary of State. I mean, that's what we hear, so. and then on the opposite side of that, 2 of the 3 things I do not meet all of the eligibility requirements are temporary things, especially the 30 days. So if someone moves into Michigan October 15th and goes and gets a driver's license and then checks that box, because they won't meet it by November 15th, but then the next year rolls around and they are eligible and yet they're not registered because they checked that box. So I wonder if there's a way to accommodate those types of things, and we allow people to register at 17 and a half. So, you know, maybe they are in the branch office a couple of months, 6 months before their 18th birthday. So it just feels like that opt-out needs some tweaking.
We actually changed the opt-out from saying decline, from saying all this, to just saying, do not use my information for voter registration. That is, rather than trying to angle around what's gonna happen, just saying, or the word decline or the word opt-out, which are sort of confusing words, was just to say, do not use the information, do not use my information on this application, if you want to be more precise, for voter registration. And that sort of shifted it, not from what I'm asking, but what I want you to do. So it's sort of clearer instructions.
Amber, I believe you had something to say?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say that, you know, Whitney's there and can speak to this, but we went through this implementation in Colorado, tried a few different variations, actually tested out the language, how the interactions were going to be at the DMV, so that might be instructive to Michigan as they contemplate this. And the second question I had for somebody on the Michigan team, because I don't know the answer to this, does the DMV agent know up front at the point of transaction whether or not the voter is currently registered to vote or not?
In most cases, yes. There is registered to vote,
So
yes. Yes, they do know if they're registered to vote.
So it says on the screen that they're an active or an inactive voter, or does it just say registered voter?
It's
or
registered,
what is
yes,
it?
no. It's registered, yes, no.
Okay, so it doesn't give them a prompt that they have to update their address or anything like that. It just says they're registered.
Amber, this is Whitney. When I was here before, Lori and her team and I went through a flow charting exercise, and we actually flow charted out all the conditions. So if it knows they're registered, if it knows they're not registered, and so on.
Got it, perfect.
The problem that Amber's alluding to in Colorado is their DMV transaction is done entirely as a verbal communication with the clerk, rather than having a printed form that the customer can fill in. And we got pretty good on the renewal by mail, but we never really solved the opt-outs. And one of the things that they found was that, Amber, correct the number if I'm wrong, but something like 20% of people who were eligible that had opted out had an address change. Now, that's not an issue here, because the address change happens automatically.
That's right.
So, but the language I just told you was what we did on the renewal by mail, or online renewal. So, and it seems to work
that's
pretty
great. And I think to your point, Whitney, what we ended up settling on is basically we're not gonna, what we found is voters didn't actually know if they were either registered or if they had updated recently or any of that. So we just now make the assumption that they need to update, and that all happens automatically. So address updates, and then if they're eligible to vote, we're assuming that that's what they want to do unless they verbally say otherwise. So I think it's the same thing. I just was curious how it was going to be done there. And the flow charting and Lean and Jenny shared all that with me. I thought it was great.
But it's really great to be able to actually know whether they're in the voter registration database. I mean, it reduces the duplicates, it lets you process it more cleanly, and it lets some of that filtering be done at the DMV rather than having to be done at the back end.
So
Absolutely.
So we have Matt, and then Nick, and then I think we need to get towards wrap-up, because we're almost at 4 or 3.
Yeah, I was just gonna say quickly, the address confidentiality program, like the lack of one in Michigan, is something that I think those of us who are interested in legislative work, like maybe we should talk about building that, because anytime we're scaring people out of the automatic system and onto paper, people out in the field with clipboards and paper are not warning people about how to maintain confidentiality of their address. That just seems like we should fix that system. And then the other thing, I could be wrong about this, but I'm nearly positive Native American photo tribal ID card is listed under identity document, but that is a proof of U.S. citizenship. I'm nearly positive. If you are an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe, you are a U.S. citizen. So wanted to flag that.
I'm sorry, which document are you looking at?
It's the old.
It's the old form, but
the
it's
old
listed
form.
as proof of identity on here.
Okay.
Identity document.
Yeah, we'll look at that. I don't know, that may have changed. Nick, sorry.
Much of the irony of all of this, I walked in the clerk's office, I didn't prove anything, I just swear to it. And I don't have to show ID to register to vote, I don't have to show proof of citizenship. I sign a form that says, I swear that I'm who I am, said I was, I swear that I'm a citizen, and I swear that I've lived in the jurisdiction, or I will have lived in the jurisdiction 30 days by the date of election. So there's a lot more double checks at the at the Secretary of State's office than there are even at the local clerk's office. On the issue of the kids, the pre-18-year-olds who don't show up in the registration, I'm not sure when we first started talking in the 80s about automatic voter registration, first question that came up was, are you a citizen? I said, just put a box on there, yes or no. And we'll register you if you are, and we won't register if you don't, unless you check the box that says, I don't want to be registered to vote. But one of the advantages that from the qualified voter file, it's basically a single statewide voter registration list that we have, and one of the reasons I kept arguing for automatic registration is we know who you are, we know where you live, and we know how old you are. And once we know whether you're a citizen or not, why do we make you fill in another form to say the same, give us the same information in order to vote? You know their age by definition. It's on the driver's license. So I'm not sure, I don't understand why a person who fills in a driver's license at 15 or 16 years of age couldn't be moved over automatically to the qualified voter file on their 18th birthday or whatever the date is. And I don't understand why we couldn't, for those who, for the others, for those who get their driver's license at 15 or 16 and then don't come back again until they're 19 and generally renew by mail. I've renewed by mail several times. Why can't that mail renewal, since I can register by mail and I can register at the branch office, why can't that just simply be used as the basis for an automatic voter registration?
Renewal by mail will. The problem with the 18-year-olds, or sometimes it's when they're 17, they're automatically mailed their updated driver's license when they go from having a graduated driver's license to a regular one.
Okay.
They don't come in and they don't have to do anything. That happens automatically when the time runs. So that,
But
we need to
that,
look
it
at that.
seems to me that what we could do, and I
Yep.
think we can do under
Right.
existing law, is I've got a driver's license application that I filled in and all the other good stuff that gave me the graduated and finally the full one, that for their 18th birthday, so much before that, because you've got to get the information out to the clerks, but this is the first election they're eligible to vote on. We know when it is, that we simply use technology to put that person onto the qualified voter file, unless they've told us they don't want it.
I think that's a goal. I think that's a great thing. If you think that is, we can get there through the law. I think that's
conducting business, right?
I would say it is. The Secretary of State has conducted business with you at a minimum.
Right.
Right, because they've sent you something.
But you've conducted business with them
Yes.
prior, you've conducted
Correct. It
business
doesn't say
with
it
them,
doesn't.
even for the graduated
Yep.
driver's license. You've conducted business with them prior to the election. And therefore, you just use that. It's just a matter of then when they get transferred onto the qualified voter file, as opposed to if they get transferred onto.
Yeah.
You're no longer doing, under the qualified voter file legislation, you are essentially doing two things at the clerk's, at the Secretary of State's office, getting your driver's license and registering to vote. Now, you're automatically registered to vote when you get your driver's license, unless you opt out. And I agree the language needs to be, I mean, my inclination would be that the language would be something like, I'm not registered and I don't want to be, or I choose not to be, is the box you check on. Otherwise, we just simply put them on the list. That doesn't force them to vote. It just says, yeah, they're eligible to vote because we know who you are, we know where you live, and we know how old you are, we know whether you're a citizen of the United States or not.
Okay, we're at 3 o'clock, so it's wrap up time. I know people have flights and drives. So we did not get to the voter outreach. That's another topic for another meeting, and perhaps there's some outreach to you all in the interim. We're looking at other meeting dates. I think we were looking at after the May election. There was one discussion I heard, right?
We'll be sending around another doodle poll.
Okay, so we'll be getting notification to you when we're looking for the next meeting. And we'll be doing some follow-up with you as a result of notes from this meeting as well.
Yeah, and one thing that would also be helpful for people to think about, we don't need an answer now, is just sort of what makes the most sense for this committee's work product to look like? Like, what do we want to have coming out of this? So, because we have a lot of ideas, and our job is now to collect those, and thank you again. But yeah, that's just one thing would be helpful for some thoughts on.
Yeah.
This is Loida, the Director of Public Engagement for the Secretary's Office. If you already had points on the outreach and education piece, if you want to send those to me, I'm happy to take those now or via email or however you want to reach out to me. You can set up a meeting so that at least by the next meeting, we've started that conversation in some sort of format and we don't have to dig in. So we can start early. Oh, yes, it's Tapia L at michigan.gov. So TAPIA, yes.
If they're
L
Yeah.
at Michigan.
And everyone, if you have further comments or comments on the drafts that you've seen, things that you weren't able to say during today's discussion, or things that you think about when you're on your drive or flight home, you can also email me. My email address is marsh, like a swamp, so MARSH, S as in Sally, and then 3 at michigan.gov. So you can also just email me any thoughts that you have or things that you really think that we should try to tackle at the next meeting. Sort of anything that comes to mind, feel free to reach out. Would love to hear from you.
Piggybacking on that, many of you, the clerks all here for sure, but others as well, see our regular communications and our news updates, and as we talked about at the beginning, like our first initial blush here, you'll start to see all those. Especially those having May elections, but anybody and everybody, as you're seeing those communications and you have suggestions for us moving forward, I would include that as well. And for anyone who doesn't see those news updates, if you want to let us know, we can get you signed up for those quite easily. We'll just put you all on. Okay, well, that's easy. We have all your email addresses.
We can opt out.
Okay.
No such thing.
So I just want to say thank you all again for being a part of this and for your input and discussions today. Thank you, Chris, again for leading us, and Sally and Lori and a great team here at the department. We've got, as you can see, a lot of details to sort through, but a great opportunity to sort through it. And I wanted to thank again the Prop 3 folks who led the way so that we're here today grappling with a lot of these details, because we're all going to be in a better state because of it. And I hope this can provide the platform or a first step towards moving us in a more modern direction for our elections, so that we're, after we get through this piece, perhaps in a place where we can start thinking even, what do we look like, what does our democracy in Michigan look like 10 years from now? And what do we want to start building towards in that regard, and stay ahead of the curve so that we're never again trying to catch up to the majority of states in the country, but instead we're out there leading. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right,
Thank
see you
you
next
all.
time.